I think I remember the exact moment when Arjun said we should take the long drive, and looking back now I realize that if I had just said no, if I had just told him that I was tired, or that I had college work pending, or that my mom would be upset if I came home late, then none of what happened that night would have happened to us, and the three of us would still be the same three idiots who argued about whose playlist was better and who had to pay for the petrol and who got to sit in the front seat. And I think about that moment of decision almost every single day now, every morning when I wake up and every night when I'm trying to sleep and failing because sleep stopped coming easily after that night on the bridge. And I want you to understand, before I tell you any of this, that I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or supernatural things or any of that. I grew up in a practical household where my father was an engineer and my mother was a school teacher, and we didn't have space in our lives for things that couldn't be explained rationally. And so what I'm about to tell you isn't coming from someone who was looking for a ghost story or who was predisposed to interpret strange events in a supernatural way. It's coming from someone who is genuinely terrified by the memory of what happened and who still can't explain it and who needs, desperately, to put it into words so that maybe someone else can help me make sense of it. Because I have not been able to make sense of it on my own, no matter how many nights I've lain awake, trying to reconstruct the events in a logical sequence that adds up to something reasonable and explainable and safe. The three of us had been friends since class 8, which means we'd known each other for almost 9 years by that point, and if you'd asked any of us to describe our friendship, we would have given you the same answer in 3 different ways, which is to say that Arjun would have said something dramatic and quotable, Faraz would have said something practical and slightly dismissive about sentimentality, and I would have said something that tried to be honest while also being careful not to embarrass anyone, because that's always been my role in the group, the one who tries to manage the emotional temperature of things, the one who says, maybe we should think about this first, when Arjun wants to do something impulsive, and the one who says, okay, but it could also be fun, when Faraz is being too cautious. And I think the reason that dynamic worked so well for so long was that we genuinely balanced each other out in ways that made all three of us better than we would have been individually. And I miss that about us. I miss the ease of it. I miss the way we could spend 6 hours in a car together arguing about nothing and arrive at our destination feeling more energized than when we left. And I can't explain it, but that particular version of our friendship ended on that bridge on that night, and whatever we've been to each other since then is something different and quieter and sadder in ways that none of us have been willing to talk about directly. It was Arjun's idea, like most of our ideas were, because Arjun was the kind of person who woke up at 9 in the evening feeling restless and immediately needed to convert that restlessness into an adventure that usually involved convincing 2 other people to abandon whatever sensible plans they had for the night. And I should have known from the way he texted that something about the evening was going to go sideways, because he didn't just say, "long drive tonight," the way he usually did. He said something like, "I need to get out of this city right now. I need to drive somewhere I've never been. Come with me." And there was an urgency to that message that felt different from his usual casual invitations. And Faraz told me later that he'd had the same feeling when he got the text, but that he'd ignored it because Arjun was always dramatic and that was just how he communicated. But I think we both should have paid more attention to the fact that Arjun seemed genuinely agitated that evening, rather than just bored, and I still don't understand what was going on with him internally that night, because he never really explained it even after everything happened. He just said he'd had a bad feeling all day and wanted to shake it off, which is maybe the least reassuring explanation for initiating a late-night drive into unfamiliar territory that I've ever heard from another human being. Faraz was already at Arjun's place by the time I got there, which told me that Faraz had been just as persuadable as I was. And the 2 of them were standing in the driveway, looking at the car, with the kind of energy that meant we were definitely going whether I thought it was a good idea or not. And to be fair to myself, I want to say that I did hesitate. I did stand there for a moment looking at the car and feeling something uncomfortable move through my chest like cold water seeping under a door. And I can't explain it, but I almost turned around right then and went home. And I think about that moment constantly now, because it was the last moment where the evening could have gone differently. The last moment where we were all still safely inside the ordinary world, with ordinary problems and ordinary nights ahead of us. And I chose to walk forward and get into the back seat, because Arjun was already turning the ignition and Faraz was climbing into the passenger seat. And that cold water feeling in my chest was probably just anxiety, and I'd always been slightly anxious, so I was used to ignoring it. And that's one of the things I regret most about my personality, the way I've been trained by years of being told I'm overthinking things to dismiss the signals my body sends me when something is actually wrong. Arjun's car was a second-hand Hyundai Santro that was older than any of us wanted to admit, and that had a persistent rattle somewhere in the dashboard that we had all become so accustomed to that we only noticed it when it stopped, which it sometimes did for no reason. And the interior smelled like the pine-shaped air freshener that Arjun's older sister had hung from the rearview mirror and that had long since lost its scent, but remained hanging there out of some kind of habitual loyalty to its original purpose. And the back seat where I always sat was comfortable in the specific way that a seat becomes comfortable after years of one person sitting in it. Because the cushion had learned the shape of my body and received me like an old acquaintance, and I remember thinking as we pulled out of the colony and onto the main road that there was nothing in the world quite like the particular peace of being in a car with your best friends late at night, with nowhere you had to be and no time you had to be back by. And that thought fills me with a specific kind of sadness now that I couldn't have anticipated feeling then. The sadness of knowing that you're remembering a happiness that's already over before you know it's over. A happiness you didn't know to be grateful for while you were inside it. Looking back now, I think the first thing that should have concerned us was how quickly the city thinned out around us. Because Arjun had said he wanted to drive somewhere he'd never been, and he'd plugged in Google Maps on his phone and mounted it on the dashboard and told it to take us somewhere interesting without being more specific than that. And I'm not entirely sure that's how Google Maps works, but Arjun had his own relationship with technology that was part intuitive and part delusional. And the app had given him a route that took us through the outskirts in a direction that none of us recognized. Past the industrial areas and then the farmland, and then into stretches of road that had no street lamps and no other cars and no indication of habitation in any direction. And I remember asking from the back seat where exactly we were going, and Arjun saying "Adventure, yar, adventure," in that tone he used when he thought a question was too boring to deserve a real answer. And Faraz saying, "I looked it up. There's a dhaba about 40 kilometers from here that's supposed to be really good. We'll eat there and come back." And I remember feeling slightly reassured by the specificity of that plan, even though the dhaba turned out to be completely irrelevant to anything that actually happened that night, a detail I'd forgotten until just now that I'm writing this, which is strange because I think about that night constantly, and yet there are these small details that keep surfacing, like objects floating up from dark water, things I'd submerged without realizing it. And I know that some of you reading this might be thinking that 3 young men driving down an unfamiliar road late at night is not inherently frightening, and you're right, it isn't. And I want you to understand that none of us were frightened at that point. We were playing music and arguing about whether the particular song that was playing was good or just nostalgic, which is a meaningless argument, but one we'd been having in various forms for years. And the road was quiet in the pleasant way that roads are quiet at night when you have good company. And the night outside the windows was dark, but in a comfortable way, the way darkness is comfortable when you're inside something warm and moving and surrounded by people you trust completely. And I can't explain it, but there's a particular quality to that kind of night that makes you feel simultaneously very small against the world and very safe within your own little pocket of light and warmth and friendship. And I was feeling exactly that way when the road started to change. And that particular moment when the road changed is one of the things I have turned over and examined so many times in my memory that I'm no longer sure I'm remembering what actually happened versus what my mind has constructed to fill in the gaps. The tarmac road gave way to a kacharasta so gradually that none of us really noticed it happening in real time, which is the kind of thing that sounds impossible until you experience it yourself, because you'd think that the difference between a paved road and an unpaved one would be immediately obvious and jarring, and it should be. But we were distracted, and the transition happened in stages over maybe 2 or 3 kilometers. First the road getting slightly rougher than it had been, then the surface becoming more broken and patchy, then the patches becoming larger than the tarmac itself, until at some point we were driving on pure compressed earth and gravel and the memory of where the tarmac had once been. And Arjun had not noticed, or if he had noticed he hadn't said anything because he was still talking about the song and whether nostalgia was a legitimate aesthetic experience or just a form of self-deception. And it was Faraz who finally said, "Yar, I think we've left the main road." In that calm way Faraz had of stating obvious things that had somehow escaped everyone's attention. And Arjun looked at the map's navigation on his phone and said, No, it's fine. Maps says keep going, the road improves ahead." And looking back now, I should have said something then, I should have insisted. But I didn't, and we kept going, and the road did not improve. I should have known from the way the headlights were catching the dust rising from the unpaved road that we were in unfamiliar territory, in a way that the map's navigation wasn't adequately accounting for. Because there's a particular quality to the dust on old Kacha roads that tells you they haven't been driven on recently. A fineness and depth to it that means it's been accumulating undisturbed for some time. And the ruts in the road were deep and irregular in a way that suggested they'd been made by vehicle traffic that had come this way before but a long time ago. And I noticed these things from the back seat without quite articulating them to myself in any clear way. I just felt the unease of them without having the specific vocabulary to name what was wrong. And I think that's how dread works most of the time, actually. It arrives as a physical sensation. Before it arrives as a thought, your body knows something is wrong before your mind catches up with the specifics. And by the time your mind figures out how to put language to the fear, your body has already been screaming at you for several minutes or hours or whatever the time scale is. And I've noticed this about myself particularly, that I am very good at feeling fear and very slow at acknowledging it, which is a combination that has not historically served me well. Arjun kept driving because Arjun was the kind of person who trusted technology over instinct and who would follow a GPS route into a riverbed before admitting that maybe the app had made a mistake. And I want to be fair to him because I'm exactly the opposite kind of person who trusts instinct over everything and has gotten myself into just as many problems by refusing to follow any plan at all. And the truth is that neither approach is inherently correct, and what we needed in that car that night was probably a combination of the two. Someone who could read the physical signals of the environment while also having the discipline to think through options systematically before making a decision. And what we had instead was Arjun's blind faith in the blue line on his phone screen and Faraz's practical silence, and my increasingly cold feeling in my chest that I was still telling myself was probably just the anxiety that had never quite left me since I was a child, since the thing that happened with my sister when I was 12 years old. Since the thing I have never told anyone about, not even Arjun and Faraz, because it is the kind of thing that sounds completely implausible when you say it out loud. And I've learned over the years that some people will accept the story, while others will look at you with a mixture of pity and skepticism that makes you want to stop talking immediately. And so I've kept it to myself all these years, and I think that particular silence, that particular weight I'd been carrying alone, made me more susceptible to what started happening on that road than I might otherwise have been. Because I was already living with one thing I couldn't share and couldn't explain, and whatever influence the road began to exert on me found purchase in that already existing wound. The bridge appeared in the headlights so suddenly that Arjun had to brake harder than any of us expected, and I remember being thrown forward against the back of Faraz's seat and Faraz reaching out instinctively to brace against the dashboard and Arjun saying, "Bloody hell, sorry," in that tight voice he used when he was startled. And we all sat there for a moment with the engine still running and the headlights illuminating what was ahead of us. And what was ahead of us was a bridge, or what had once been a bridge, a structure that spanned a nala that was maybe 8 or 10 meters wide and deep enough that the headlights couldn't illuminate the bottom. And the bridge itself was in a state of significant deterioration that made it immediately clear that it was not safe to cross. That in fact crossing it would have been something that no rational person would attempt, because the railing on the left side was completely gone. The concrete surface of the deck was broken through in at least 2 places visible from where we were stopped, and the near end of the bridge had settled at an angle that suggested the foundation on one side had partially subsided. And all of this was visible in the yellow-white light of the headlights, and all of it was uniformly and unambiguously alarming. And yet, the Google Maps navigation on Arjun's phone, in the calm, unhurried voice it had been using all night to give directions, said, "Go straight." That particular moment, the moment of the navigation voice saying, "Go straight," while we were looking at a broken bridge over a deep nala, in the middle of nowhere at approximately 11:30 at night, is the moment that keeps returning to me with the most clarity and the most physical sensation. Because I remember exactly how the words felt landing in the car, landing in the silence that had followed the abrupt stop. And I remember Faraz making a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a gasp, but was something in between. And I remember Arjun reaching for his phone to look at the screen. And I remember looking out through the windshield at the broken bridge and feeling the cold water, feeling in my chest spread outward to my hands and my face. And I think I said something like, "Okay, we should turn around." And Arjun said, "Obviously." And Faraz said nothing at all, which was unusual for Faraz, who always had something to say. And I turned to look at Faraz to check if he was okay, and he was looking straight ahead at the bridge with an expression on his face that I hadn't seen there before, and couldn't quite categorize. Something between concentration and blankness, like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. And that expression on Faraz's face scared me almost as much as the bridge itself, because Faraz had always been the most reliably grounded of the three of us, and seeing him look unmoored was like seeing a compass needle spin randomly. It removed a reference point I hadn't realized I was depending on. I still don't understand what happened next in terms of the sequence of events, because my memory of the next few minutes is fractured in ways that other memories from that night are not, and I want to be transparent about that because I think the gaps in my memory are as important to the story as the parts I do remember, because they tell you something about how my mind was responding to what was happening. And what I remember is that Arjun put the car in reverse and turned around in the narrow dirt road, which took several back and forth maneuvers because the road was barely wide enough for the car. And during those maneuvers, the headlights swept across the surrounding area and illuminated scrubby trees and flat, dry ground. And then I think I remember one of those sweeps illuminating something else. But I'm not certain, and I don't want to tell you what I think I saw before I tell you what I know I saw, because I've made the mistake in the past of leading with the uncertain things, and then when the certain things turn out to be strange enough on their own, it seems like the uncertain things were exaggeration or invention. And I want you to believe me about the certain things. That's important to me, so let me stay with the sequence. The certain thing is that when Arjun finally had the car pointed back in the direction we'd come from, he pressed the accelerator, and the car didn't move forward. The tires spun on the loose dirt surface, and the car fishtailed slightly, and then stopped again. And Arjun said a word I won't write here, but that you can probably imagine given the context, and tried again, and the tires spun again. And Faraz said, "Easy, easy, rock it gently," in a voice that was almost his normal voice but slightly higher than usual. And Arjun rocked it gently, and after about 30 seconds of this, the tires found purchase and the car lurched forward and we were moving. And I felt such a rush of relief at the sensation of forward movement that I actually exhaled loudly. And then I heard Arjun say, "Oh," in a very small, very flat voice. And I looked up from the floor of the car where I'd been staring during the stuck tire crisis, and I saw the glow of the brake lights of another car reflected in our windshield. Red light spreading across the glass like something bleeding, because there was a car parked directly across the road ahead of us, blocking our path. A car that had not been there when we had driven in from this direction. A car that had not been there when we had gone through the back and forth of turning around. A car that appeared to have materialized on that road. During the 2 or 3 minutes we had been occupied with getting unstuck, and its headlights were off and it was dark and we could not see inside it. If I'm being honest, which is what I'm trying to be, even though it's difficult because some of these memories are ones I have tried very hard not to look at directly. The first thing I felt when I saw that car was not fear exactly, but something more like the cognitive disorientation of seeing something that your mind refuses to initially process as real. The same feeling you get when you see a person you know in a context where they have no reason to be, except that in this case, the wrongness wasn't about who was there, but about the fact that something was there at all when there was no logical mechanism by which it could have gotten there. And I know that sounds strange because, obviously, cars can drive themselves places. That's literally what cars do. But the point is that none of us had heard anything approach. There had been no sound of another engine, no sweep of headlights, and the road was narrow enough and the night was quiet enough and we had been paying attention enough that if another vehicle had come up behind us during those 2 or 3 minutes, we would have been aware of it. And the fact that we weren't is what my mind kept catching on like a sleeve on a nail. That gap between what should have been perceivable and what actually had registered with any of us. Arjun stopped our car, and for a moment, nobody said anything. And the three of us just sat there in the glow of our own headlights, looking at the dark car, blocking the road ahead. And I think we were all doing the same thing, which was waiting for something to happen, waiting for the other car to move, or for a door to open, or for someone to get out, and nothing happened. The car just sat there with its headlights off and its engine apparently not running and no visible movement inside it. And I remember thinking that it must just be a coincidence, that it must be someone else who'd gotten lost on this same road, some other group of people who'd stopped for whatever reason, and that if we waited a moment they'd sort themselves out and move on. And I was holding very tightly to this explanation, because the alternative was something I didn't want to approach yet, the alternative being that there was something wrong with the car ahead of us in a way that extended beyond the merely inconvenient into something genuinely threatening. And I was still in the part of the experience where I was trying to keep both options open, because collapsing the possibility space prematurely in situations like this is how you make bad decisions driven by panic. It was Faraz who said quietly, "There's no one driving that car." And I remember the specific way those words hit the interior of the Santro, the way they seemed to take up more space than the words themselves should have occupied. And I remember Arjun saying, "What do you mean? Of course, there's someone driving it. How else would it be here?" And Faraz said, "I mean, look at it. Look at the driver's side. There's no one there." And we all looked. We leaned forward and looked through the windshield into the darkness of the car ahead, trying to make out through two windshields and the dark night what the interior of that car contained. And I can't be certain of what I saw, but what I thought I saw was that the driver's seat appeared to be empty. And what I also thought I saw, though I want to emphasize that the visibility was poor and I could have been wrong, was that the back seat of the other car did not appear to be empty, that there were shapes in the back seat, though I couldn't make out any detail about those shapes. And I turned to say something to Arjun about this, and that's when my phone rang. I should have known that the phone ringing at that moment was not a coincidence, not because I believe in the kind of universe where coincidences are impossible, but because of how it rang, because there was something wrong with the sound of it. Something subtly off about the ringtone that I can't adequately describe, except to say that it sounded like my normal ringtone, playing through water or playing backwards or playing at a frequency that was slightly lower than normal, in a way that made it physically unpleasant to hear. And I looked at the screen, and the number was one I didn't recognize, not a saved contact, just a string of digits that meant nothing to me. And I almost didn't answer it because I have a personal policy about unknown numbers, and also because the sound of the ring was making the cold water feeling in my chest very intense indeed. But something made me answer it, some pull I couldn't resist, or maybe I just needed to know what it was. And I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear, and for a moment there was just silence, and then there was the voice. The worst part was that I recognized the voice immediately, and what I recognized it as was the Google Maps navigation voice, the same synthesized, calm female voice that had been guiding us all night. The voice that had said, "Turn left in 200 meters," and "You have arrived at your destination," and most recently, "Go straight," while we were looking at the broken bridge. And the voice said, "Main Kahana," which means, "Didn't I tell you?" And then it said, "Side Jao," which means, "Go straight." And then it said something I've repeated to myself so many times since that night that I'm no longer certain whether I'm remembering the words or remembering my memory of the words. It said, "Humsab wait kar rahe hain," which means, "We're all waiting." And then the call ended. And I sat there holding the phone against my ear in the silence after the call ended, and I couldn't move, and I couldn't speak, and I couldn't process what had just happened, because the processing capacity of my brain had been fully occupied by the act of hearing those words in that voice in that situation. And it wasn't until Arjun said, "Who was that?" that I became aware that Arjun and Faraz were both looking at me with expressions that told me my face was doing something they found alarming. And I know what you're thinking right now, because I was thinking the same thing. You're thinking there's an explanation for this, that it was a prank or a wrong number or some glitch in the mapping application that caused it to call my phone somehow. And I want you to know that I have thought through every single logical explanation that exists, and none of them actually work when you examine them closely, because for any of those explanations to be correct, you would have to account for the timing of the call, for the fact that it used my personal phone number, which had no connection to the Google Maps app, for the content of the message, which referenced the specific instruction, "Sida Jiao," that the navigation had given us at the bridge, and for the voice, which was not just similar to the navigation voice, but was the navigation voice with something added to it, something underneath it, like a second frequency running beneath the primary tone. And if you have an explanation that accounts for all of those things simultaneously, I genuinely want to hear it. Please tell me. I mean that with full sincerity, because a good rational explanation for what I heard on that call would give me more peace than I have had in months. I told Arjun and Faraz what the call had said, and I think I'm remembered for being relatively calm about it, which I have to attribute entirely to shock, because internally I was experiencing something that I can only describe as like standing in a river with the current getting suddenly, unexpectedly stronger. Like the ground under my feet was dissolving and I was trying to remain upright, through will alone, and Arjun's response was to say, "For fuck's sake," which was so thoroughly Arjun that under any other circumstances, it would have made me laugh. And Faraz's response was to say nothing at all for a very long moment, and then to say, "We need to turn the headlights on that car." And Arjun said, "What?" And Faraz said, "The car blocking us. We need to illuminate it properly. We need to see what's in it." And something about the calm deliberateness of Faraz saying this was deeply frightening to me, because it meant that Faraz, the practical one, the one who always had a reasonable explanation, had already moved past the stage of reasonable explanations and was operating in a space beyond them. And that movement in Faraz terrified me in a way that the car and the phone call had not quite reached, because external things can be explained, but a change in Faraz's way of approaching the world could not. Arjun drove forward slowly, very slowly, crawling toward the blocking car, with his high beams on now, the stronger lights reaching further and illuminating the car ahead more fully. And I want you to understand that I'm going to describe to you what those lights showed us, and I want you to believe me, because I have not exaggerated a single element of this account. I have in fact been more restrained in describing what I saw than the actual intensity of the experience would justify. Because the actual intensity of the experience is something I don't fully trust myself to convey without it sounding like something out of a film or a story, which it did sound like, which is part of what made it so disorienting. The fact that what was happening to us had the shape and texture of a story that we had all heard versions of before. And yet here it was happening in physical reality, in a second-hand Santro, on a Kachar road in the middle of the night, and the high beams showed us that the car blocking the road was a white Ambassador. The old kind, the kind that looked like slightly melted British cars from the 1950s. And the driver's seat was empty, as Faraz had said, and the front passenger seat was also empty. But the back seat was not empty, and what was in the back seat was 3 figures, seated upright, and the 3 figures were wearing the same clothes as us. That particular moment, looking through the Santro's windshield at the 3 figures in the back seat of the Ambassador, is the moment that has haunted me most persistently since that night. More than the phone call, more than the navigation voice, more than the broken bridge. Because the figures were wearing Arjun's red hoodie and Faraz's gray jacket and my blue shirt. The exact clothes we were wearing at that exact moment, and the figures were seated in the same relative positions as us. The one in the red hoodie on the left, the one in the gray jacket in the middle, the one in the blue shirt on the right. And their heads were slightly bowed, and they were not moving, and they had the quality of things that were imitating human beings, with most of the details correct, but something fundamentally absent, something that makes the difference between a living person and a very good sculpture, some animating principle that wasn't there. And I think I said bloody hell, and I think Arjun said for fuck's sake, and I think Faraz said nothing at all and just kept looking at them with that particular expression I'd never seen on his face before that night. The listening expression, and then the headlights of the Ambassador came on. Looking back now, I know that the moment the ambassador's headlights came on should have been the moment we acted. Should have been the moment that one of us did something decisive and got us out of there. And it's a question I've asked myself many times since then, what we should have done. Whether we should have reversed back toward the broken bridge and found some way around it, or whether we should have driven directly at the ambassador and tested whether the figures in the back seat would do anything to stop us, or whether one of us should have gotten out of the car and physically moved whatever was in the road. And none of these options seem obviously correct in retrospect. And none of them seemed obviously correct in the moment either, because the moment the headlights of the ambassador came on, what they illuminated was us. They were pointed directly at us through the gap between the ambassador and the trees on either side of the narrow road. And the light that came from them was wrong, in the same way that the ringtone had been wrong, subtly wrong in a way that was hard to articulate. The light was slightly yellower than headlights should be, and slightly softer, and it reached further than headlights physically should at that distance, in that night air. And it fell across our faces and across the interior of the Santro, and I felt it on my skin as something physical, as a warmth I hadn't expected, and that warmth was the single most frightening element of the entire experience, for reasons I have thought about extensively and still cannot fully explain, except to say that you don't expect light to have physical presence, and when it does, it suggests that the light is not entirely what you think it is. I had never told anyone about what happened to my sister when I was younger, and I think about that now in relation to that moment in the ambassador's headlights, because the feeling of that light on my face was the same feeling I had experienced once as a child. The same unnatural warmth reaching across a space toward me, with something specific in mind. And I don't know how to describe the connection between those two experiences, except to say that my body recognized it the way your body recognizes a smell from a long time ago. Immediately and completely, and with the full weight of everything associated with that first encounter arriving all at once, and that recognition, that sense of something from my childhood, returning in a form I hadn't expected and couldn't have prepared for, was what finally broke through whatever wall of rationalization I'd been maintaining and allowed real fear, genuine, uncomplicated fear, to move through me like cold water rising, like the current in that imaginary river, finally strong enough to take my feet out from under me. Arjun reversed the car, and this time there was no sticking in the dirt. The tires found grip immediately, and we shot backward, and Arjun kept going in reverse, rather than trying to turn around because the road was too narrow for a three-point turn at speed, and he just kept reversing with the rear camera helping him see the road behind us and the headlights of the ambassador staying fixed, not following us, just watching us go, illuminating the dust cloud our tires were throwing up as we reversed away from it, and Faraz was looking back through the rear windshield with the same expression he'd been wearing since we arrived at the bridge, and I was watching the ambassador and the three figures in its back seat through the front windshield, and the figures were still not moving, still seated with their heads bowed in their red hoodie and gray jacket and blue shirt. And I remember thinking very clearly, with a clarity that I attribute entirely to shock, that if we had driven straight across that broken bridge, we would have fallen into the Nala, and the car would have been found later, and the three bodies inside it would have been wearing exactly those clothes and would have been arranged in the back seat of the ambassador in exactly those positions, and that the figures in the back seat were not a warning but a fact of some alternate version of this night that had already happened, or that was trying to happen, and that we were somehow moving away from its speed in a second-hand Santro with a rattling dashboard. I still don't understand all of what happened after that, and I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I don't mean that I'm being coy or that I'm saving something for later. I mean that my memory of the next 45 minutes or so has genuine gaps in it that I cannot account for, and that I've tried to account for through various methods, including writing everything down multiple times immediately after the fact and comparing the versions, and the gaps persist across all versions, which tells me they're not gaps caused by ordinary forgetting, but gaps caused by something else, some disruption to the recording process itself, and what I do remember is fragments. Arjun's hands on the steering wheel, shaking and then not shaking and then shaking again. Faraz asking for water from the bottle in the door pocket and drinking it all in one continuous movement.
the road getting better under the tires as we reversed, tarmac returning under the wheels, the sound of the dashboard rattle, which I'd stopped noticing and then suddenly noticed again as if hearing it for the first time. And then at some point we were on a lit road with other cars and Arjun pulled over to the shoulder and stopped and put his forehead against the top of the steering wheel, and none of us said anything for a long time. If I'm being honest about those minutes by the side of the road, I have to tell you that the thing I most wanted in the world in that moment was to call my sister, and the fact that I wanted that is itself a complicated thing that I won't fully unpack here, but that tells you something about where my mind went when it was trying to find solid ground. It went to family, it went to the oldest connection I had, and it went there specifically because of what had happened between us when we were children. Because in a strange way, what I had experienced on that road felt continuous with what had happened then, felt like part of the same category of event, and I think maybe part of me had always known that what happened to my sister and I as children was not a one-time thing, that it had left some kind of mark or established some kind of connection that would eventually be tested again in a different form, and that the testing had now occurred, and I had the disorienting sensation of something having been confirmed that I had spent years trying to remain uncertain about. It was Faraz who finally spoke, and what he said was, "We're not going to talk about this tonight." And Arjun lifted his head from the steering wheel and looked at Faraz and said, "What?" And Faraz said, "I mean it. Not tonight. Tonight we're going to drive home, and we're going to say we had a good drive and got tea somewhere and came back, and then we're each going to decide on our own what we think happened and what we're willing to say about it." And Arjun said, "Faraz, there was a car blocking the road with 3. And Faraz said, "I know what there was. I was sitting right here. I saw it too. What I'm saying is we are not going to try to process it right now, because right now none of us is in a condition to process anything clearly, and making decisions about what happened under these conditions is going to lead to conclusions that aren't reliable." And I remember thinking that this was the most words I had ever heard Faraz say in a single breath, and also that he was completely right. And that there was something both reassuring and frightening about the fact that Faraz had moved so quickly into this mode of deliberate management, as if somewhere underneath his usual calm, he had been maintaining a protocol for exactly this kind of situation. Arjun drove us home, and we did not talk about it on the way home. We listened to music like we always did, and we said things about the music like we always did, and none of it felt real in the slightest, but we maintained it because the alternative was worse. And I watched the city reappear around us, the street lamps and the late-night traffic and the dhabas and the pawn shops and the stray dogs and all the ordinary texture of the city, and it had never seemed so valuable to me as it did in those moments of returning to it. The sheer, solid, ordinary fairness of it. The way it existed, regardless of whether you were paying attention to it or not. The way it required nothing of you except your presence. And I felt the city receiving us back like something forgiving and indifferent, and I wanted to cry, but I didn't, because Arjun didn't and Faraz didn't, and we had the unspoken agreement that none of us would be the first to come apart, that we would hold it together until we were alone and could fall apart privately, which I think we all did, in our separate houses and in our separate beds, in the privacy of the dark. The days after that night were strange, in ways I find difficult to describe, because the strangeness wasn't dramatic, it wasn't supernatural events continuing to happen, it was more like the world had a different texture than it had before. Like something had been subtly adjusted in the contrast and brightness settings of reality, and I kept noticing things that I couldn't have said with certainty were different, but that felt different. The way light fell through windows, the way sounds arrived from outside, the way people's faces looked in moments of transition between expressions. And I want to be very clear that I am not a person who normally thinks in these terms. I am not a poetic person by nature. I think fairly literally about the world, and I've always been slightly suspicious of people who describe their emotional states through elaborate metaphor. But something had changed in how I perceived things, and I don't have any other language for it except to say that the world seemed slightly more transparent than it had before. Like the surface of things had become thinner and I was more aware of whatever was underneath. My phone received calls from the same unknown number on 3 separate occasions over the following week, and I didn't answer any of them, and each time I saw that number on my screen, I felt the cold water feeling so intensely that I had to put the phone down and breathe deliberately, for a few minutes before I could move on with whatever I'd been doing. And each time I thought about whether I should block the number or report it or just answer it and get whatever it wanted to say over with. And I never did any of those things. I just let the calls go unanswered and tried to carry on. And the fourth time the number appeared, I made myself look at the call log, and I noticed that the calls were getting closer together. The first had come 2 days after that night, the second 1 day later, the third 12 hours after that, and the fourth call was arriving 6 hours after the third, and the pattern was obvious and deliberate and deeply unpleasant, like whatever was on the other end was getting more insistent or more desperate or more angry at my continued refusal to pick up. And the call log would later become one of the pieces of evidence I tried to preserve, which is why it matters to me to tell you that those records are now completely gone from my phone, scrubbed clean as if they never existed. I've tried to retrieve those call logs since then through various means, through my phone carrier's records, request process, and through the phone's own backup system. And the carrier told me that the number didn't appear in their records and that the calls I was describing had not originated from any registered number on their network, which is either impossible or evidence of something I don't know how to categorize. And the backup system showed the call log for that week, but with those specific entries missing. Not deleted, but missing in the specific technical sense. That means the data was never recorded, rather than the data was recorded and then erased, and I can't explain it, but that particular distinction between never recorded and erased has bothered me more than the missing records themselves, because it suggests that whatever made those calls was doing it in a way that fell outside the normal parameters of how phone calls work, which either means sophisticated technical interference or something else, and I find myself unable to commit to either explanation with the degree of certainty that my engineer father's way of thinking demands. Have you ever gotten a call from a number you didn't recognize and felt before answering it that something about the call was wrong, some quality of the ring itself or some instinct about who was on the other end that arrived before you had any information to base it on? I ask this genuinely because what I've described about those calls is what I mean, and I want to know if it resonates with any experience you've had. Not because I think my experience is common, but because I think the fundamental mechanism of it, the way the wrongness of it arrived as a physical sensation before it arrived as a thought, might be familiar to more people than are willing to talk about it. And if that's something you've experienced, I want to hear about it. I genuinely do. Because at this point in my life, collecting evidence that other people have had adjacent experiences is one of the main things keeping me from concluding that I have simply lost my mind entirely. It was about 3 weeks after the night at the bridge that Faraz called me, which was notable because Faraz almost never calls, he texts, and the fact that he was calling told me before I answered that whatever he wanted to say was either urgent or emotional, both of which were unusual for Faraz, who operated in a register that was generally neither. And he said, "I found something," and I asked what, and he said, "You know the Kacha road, where we went that night?" And I said, "Yes," and he said, "I spent this week trying to find it on maps, on satellite view, and I can't find it. The road doesn't appear to exist. There's no bridge on any map of that area. I drove out there last week in daylight and followed the same route we took that night, and the Kacha Rasta doesn't exist. There's just farmland, no road, no nala, no bridge, nothing." And I remember standing in my kitchen holding my phone, listening to Faraz tell me this and feeling the cold water feeling, and also something else underneath it, something almost like relief, which is a strange thing to feel when someone is telling you that the place where something terrifying happened to you may not exist. But I think the relief was relief that Faraz had gone looking. That Faraz, who had told us not to talk about it, was still thinking about it and investigating it. That I wasn't holding this alone. There was an old photograph I found while I was going through some boxes in my room about a month after that night, and I want to be precise about the circumstances. Because the precision matters here. I was not looking for anything related to what happened. I was looking for a specific notebook from my second year of college that I needed for reference. And in the process of digging through boxes, I pulled out a cardboard envelope that I didn't recognize and opened it. And inside was a single photograph that I also didn't recognize and couldn't account for being in my possession. and the photograph showed a group of people standing in front of a white ambassador car on an unpaved road. And the photograph appeared to be old based on the color and the grain, perhaps 40 or 50 years old, and the people in it were dressed in clothes from that era, and they were standing in front of the car and smiling, a normal group photograph of the kind that families take on road trips. And what I noticed about the photograph, what I had to look at 3 times to be certain I was seeing correctly, was that in the background of the photograph, barely visible in the shadow of the trees lining the unpaved road, there was a wooden structure that could have been a bridge, and on the near side of that bridge was a car, a small car. And though the image was too small and too dark to make out any detail, I can tell you that the car in the background was white, and it was parked at the head of the bridge, and it was facing away from the bridge and toward the camera. And the shape of it was consistent with a second-hand Santro, and I put the photograph down and I did not pick it up again for 2 days. When I finally looked at it again, I was trying to find some explanation that didn't require me to accept what the obvious interpretation of the image suggested, which was that this photograph taken 40 or 50 years ago contained an image of a car that matched ours parked on a road that matched the road where we'd been, and at a bridge that matched the bridge we'd seen. And obviously the rational response to this is that I was seeing patterns where there were none, that I was experiencing the well-documented human tendency to find meaningful connections in ambiguous data, particularly when one is in a heightened psychological state, and that the small dark shape in the background of an old photograph could have been any car on any road near any bridge, and I held on to that rational response for quite a long time, before I noticed something else about the photograph that I had missed in my first 2 examinations of it. Something about the group of people standing in front of the ambassador in the foreground. Something about one of them in particular, the one on the far right of the group. A young woman in a printed salwar kameez who was smiling at the camera with her hand shading her eyes from the sun. And what I noticed about this woman, or thought I noticed, though I want to be appropriately uncertain here, was that she looked like someone I knew, someone whose face I saw every day in the mirror, and that if you removed 40 or 50 years of aesthetic context from the photograph and dressed her in the clothes I wore on that specific night, she would have been wearing a blue shirt. It didn't make sense until I sat with it for a very long time and let myself follow the implication wherever it led. And where it led was somewhere I didn't want to go, which was to the possibility that whatever was on that road that night was not simply a threat or a warning, but something more complicated and more personal, something that had a specific interest in me rather than in us generically, and that the figures in the back seat of the ambassador in their identical clothes were not random or symbolic but specific, were specifically me and Arjun and Faraz, arranged in the specific way we had been arranged in the Santro, which meant that whatever intelligence was operating through the ambassador and through the navigation voice and through the phone call had known we were coming before we arrived, had prepared for us, had set up a demonstration that was tailored to our specific configuration, and this possibility that we had been expected, that the entire situation had been constructed around our arrival, was more frightening to me than the figures themselves because it removed the comfort of randomness. It meant that whatever was happening was purposeful and patient and had been patient for a very long time. I lost the photograph eventually, and I am not entirely certain whether I lost it in the ordinary way that things get lost or whether I made some decision about it that I then chose not to remember, because looking back on that period, I was not entirely reliable as a witness to my own behavior. I was sleeping badly and eating irregularly and spending a lot of time on my own, which is unusual for me because I'm someone who finds solitude difficult and who processes things through conversation, and the combination of disrupted sleep and poor nutrition and isolation from the people I usually talk to was doing things to my clarity that I should have been more concerned about than I was, and my mother noticed and asked me several times if I was all right, and I said yes in the tone I use when I mean no but don't want to explain why. And my father noticed and didn't ask because my father had a policy of not asking questions whose answers he didn't want to hear. And my sister noticed from 400 kilometers away because my sister has always been able to tell when something is wrong with me in a way that has nothing to do with geography and everything to do with whatever it is that connects us, whatever it was that was activated between us when we were children, whatever it is I have never told anyone about. I started to notice changes in how I looked in the mirror during this period,
And I want to be careful about how I describe this because I know that it's the kind of claim that's easy to dismiss as psychological disturbance from someone who is already sleep-deprived and isolated and traumatized, and I'm not ruling that out. I'm genuinely not ruling it out, but I also want to describe what I actually experienced because the honest account of the experience is what I've committed to giving you, and what I experienced was a gradual, subtle wrongness about my reflection that I couldn't pinpoint the source of. It wasn't that my hair had changed or my skin had changed or my features had rearranged themselves. It was something in the quality of the reflection itself. Something about the way my reflection occupied the mirror that felt slightly off, slightly less substantial than a reflection should be. Like a photocopy of a photocopy, and I know that this is the kind of thing that sounds like the beginning of a psychotic break, and maybe it was, and maybe that's the explanation. But I also know what a psychotic break looks like because my cousin went through one in our second year of college, and the experience he described was different from what I was experiencing. His was vivid and certain and self-referential in a way that mine was not. Mine was subtle and provisional and full of self-doubt, and I don't know if that distinction is meaningful or if it's just evidence that there are different kinds of breaks. It was Arjun who told me about 6 weeks after that night that he'd been having the same dreams every night, and he told me this on the phone, which was also unusual for Arjun, because Arjun was someone who communicated emotional things in person or not at all, and he said, "Yar, every night I'm standing at that bridge and the car is there and the lights are on and I can see the three of us in the back seat and I know I'm supposed to go toward the car, but I can't make myself do it and I'm stuck there all night just looking at it. And then I wake up and it takes me half an hour to convince myself that I'm actually in my room and not still standing on that road." And I said, "I think I remember standing there too." Because I did. I'd been having versions of the same dream without realizing they were connected to his until he described them, and we talked for a long time after that, in a way we hadn't talked since the night itself. And Arjun told me that he'd been doing his own investigation and that he'd found a news article about an incident at a bridge in that general area from about 30 years ago, involving a car accident that had killed 3 young men who had apparently driven off the broken bridge in the dark, and that the car they'd been driving was a white Ambassador that had been found at the bottom of the Nala. And I said, for fuck's sake, because I'd adopted that particular response to revelations from Arjun as a kind of tribute or coping mechanism, and Arjun said exactly, and neither of us said anything for a while. It didn't make sense until I thought about it from the perspective of the Ambassador and the figures rather than from our own perspective. Because if I shifted my frame of reference and tried to imagine what the situation looked like from the other side, what I got was 3 young men who had driven off a broken bridge in a white Ambassador 30 years ago, and who had apparently not been able to stop doing so since, who had been driving up to that bridge every night or every time someone else drove up to that bridge and trying to warn them or trying to stop them or trying to do something. And the manner of the warning or stopping was the only manner available to them, which was to show the approaching people what would happen to them if they kept going, to show them their own potential end already seated in the back seat of the car. And the phone call and the navigation voice were maybe the only medium through which they could communicate. The digital infrastructure of the present grafted onto whatever mechanism of persistence they were operating through, and I find I can't explain it, but this interpretation gives me slightly more peace than the alternatives, though I want to be clear that slightly more peace than the alternatives is still not very much peace at all. I made a choice about 6 weeks after the bridge night that I still question when I'm being honest with myself, which was to go back, to drive out to the area where the road should have been and look for some physical trace of what we'd experienced, because part of me needed the confirmation that it was real. That the dirt road and the bridge and the Ambassador existed in the physical world and not just in the agreed-upon memory of 3 people who had all been in the same car and who were perhaps reinforcing each other's construction of an experience that had some more mundane basis. And I went alone, which was probably the most unambiguously bad decision I made in the entire sequence of events, and I drove out on a Saturday afternoon in full daylight, which was at least a reasonable precaution. And I followed the route we'd taken that night as closely as I could remember it, and Faraz had been right, that the Kacha Rasta didn't appear where it should have been. The farmland was continuous, where the road should have begun, and I drove up and down the main road several times looking for any break in the farmland, any track or path that could have been the beginning of the road we'd taken,
and found nothing, and I was standing by my car at the side of the road feeling a particular kind of despair that I couldn't fully categorize, not quite the despair of finding nothing but something more complicated than that, when I looked across the field of dry yellow grass and saw, perhaps a kilometer away, the broken concrete upright of what might have been a bridge railing. I should have known that walking across an unfamiliar field toward the remnants of a structure that I associated with one of the most frightening experiences of my life was not something I should do alone in the late afternoon when daylight was already beginning to soften toward evening, and I knew it in real time. I stood at the edge of the field and looked at that broken upright and felt the cold water feeling and said to myself very clearly that this was a bad idea. But I also couldn't leave without knowing, and that inability to leave without knowing is one of my specific flaws. The thing that Arjun teases me about and that Faraz respects in me and that has gotten me into trouble more times than I can count. The compulsive need to look at the thing rather than turn away from it, and I walked across the field and the grass was dry and brittle under my feet and made a sound with each step that was louder than I expected, and as I got closer I could see that the upright was indeed a piece of a bridge railing, old concrete with rusted rebar showing through where it had broken, and it was standing at the edge of a nala, and the nala was deep and dry. Bone dry the way nalas are in April, and at the bottom of the nala I could see, or thought I could see, something that might have been the rusted frame of a vehicle, and I stood at the edge looking down at it for a long time, and then I took a photograph with my phone, and I went back to my car and I drove home. I looked at the photograph when I got home, and it showed the nala and the broken railing, and what was at the bottom, and what was at the bottom was definitely the rusted remains of a vehicle, and the shape of the roofline and the basic proportions of the frame were consistent with an Ambassador from the 1980s or 1990s. And I sat with that photograph for a long time and thought about what it meant and what I was going to do with what it meant. And I thought about calling Arjun and Faraz, and I thought about not calling them, and I thought about everything that had happened over the past 6 weeks and everything that had happened over the 30 years before that in that Nala and in that Ambassador. And I thought about what it meant that we had been led there by a navigation app, and that the navigation app had said, "Go straight," and that we hadn't gone straight and that we were therefore here. And I thought about the 3 figures in the back seat of the Ambassador in our clothes and what they had been trying to tell us, and after a very long time I called Arjun, and I called Faraz, and I told them what I'd found, and I sent them the photograph. And Faraz said, "Okay," and Arjun said, "For fuck's sake." And I said, "I know," and we all stayed on the call together for a while longer, not saying much of anything, just being present for each other in the only way we could figure out how to be, through the digital connection that was the only medium we had available, which felt appropriate in ways none of us commented on. I woke up in a hospital 2 months after the bridge night, and I want to be very precise about this because it's the part of the story where my reliability as a narrator becomes most questionable. Not because I'm hiding anything, but because I genuinely do not know how I got there or how much time had passed between the last thing I remember clearly and waking up in that room. And the last thing I remember clearly is sitting in my room at around 9 in the evening, looking at the photograph of the Nala and the rusted Ambassador, and then looking up from my phone because I heard something outside my window, a sound that I can't describe accurately, but that had some quality of the wrong ringtone from the night on the road. That same subtle wrongness applied to an ordinary ambient sound, and I got up to look out the window, and what I saw or thought I saw is something I've decided not to write here because writing it might make it more real than it currently is in my memory, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that. And then the next thing I remember is the ceiling of a hospital room and a doctor asking me if I knew what day it was, and me saying a date that was apparently 3 days before the actual date. The doctors told me that I had been found by my mother in my room in a state of unresponsiveness, and that the period of unresponsiveness had lasted approximately 18 hours, and that the medical assessment found nothing physically wrong with me that would explain it. No head injury, no cardiac event, no neurological anomaly that showed up on any of the scans, and they used words like dissociative episode and acute stress response. And they asked me whether I had been sleeping and eating adequately, and I was honest with them about both of those things, and they said that the combination of sleep deprivation and poor nutrition and high stress
could produce episodes of disconnection from reality that in extreme cases could present as what I had experienced. And I found this explanation both reassuring and deeply unsatisfying in the specific way that explanations are unsatisfying when they account for the mechanism but not for the content, because the explanation for why I might go unresponsive didn't do anything to explain what I had been experiencing during those 18 hours, and I have impressions of those 18 hours that I can access if I approach them very carefully and obliquely. And those impressions are of a road and a bridge and a white ambassador and three figures with bowed heads and a voice saying, "Hum sub wait karashahen." And that's where my approach to those impressions always stops, because I can't go further than that without the cold water feeling becoming completely overwhelming. Which version of events is the true one? The doctor's version or my own version is a question I have genuinely no answer to. And I don't mean that in the evasive way that people sometimes say they have no answer to avoid committing to something uncomfortable. I mean it in the literal sense that I have examined both versions as carefully as I'm able to, and I cannot determine which one more accurately describes what actually happened to me during those 18 hours. And I find that uncertainty genuinely destabilizing in a way that I think is itself evidence of something, because I am normally a person who can tolerate uncertainty reasonably well, who has made peace with the fact that many things in life are ambiguous and unknowable, and that demanding certainty from an uncertain world is a recipe for suffering. And yet the uncertainty about those 18 hours feels different from other uncertainties I've made peace with. It feels like a gap in the floor of myself rather than a gap in the floor of the world. And a gap in the floor of yourself is not something you can simply avoid stepping in. Even though I've left the city now and moved somewhere smaller and quieter, where I don't know anyone and no one knows what happened to me, things still happen that I can't explain and that remind me that whatever I experienced didn't end when I left or when I woke up in that hospital or when any of the apparent endpoints of the experience occurred. And I want to be honest about this because I think the ongoing nature of it is the most important thing to communicate, the thing that makes this more than just a disturbing story about one night on one road. And what I mean by ongoing is this. Sometimes I'll be in the middle of an ordinary task, washing dishes or reading or walking to the market, and I'll realize that I have no memory of the previous 15 or 20 minutes. That time has passed without my awareness of passing through it. And sometimes I'll look at my hands while I'm doing something, and they'll seem unfamiliar to me in a way that's hard to articulate. Not different exactly, but somehow less certainly mine. And sometimes I'll be navigating somewhere using my phone, and the voice from the navigation will say something ordinary, like turn right in 500 meters, and something will happen in my body that is beyond rational in its intensity. A response that belongs to a very specific night on a very specific road and has no business showing up in ordinary daylight navigation, and I'll have to pull over and breathe for a while before I can continue. And have you felt something similar? That quality of an experience that should be over but that keeps sending ripples forward into your present life? That sense of something having changed in how you occupy your own body or how you move through the world, something you can't quite put back the way it was? I ask, because I sometimes think the worst part of experiences like this isn't the experience itself, but the aftermath, the long tail of it, the way it keeps interfering with ordinary life in small ways that add up to something significant. And I wonder if this is a pattern that other people have lived through. If the experience of something that shouldn't have happened, leaving a mark that keeps showing up in unexpected moments, is something that happens to more people than talk about it. And if it is, I want you to know that I would genuinely like to hear about your experience, because what I've found is that the isolation of these things is worse than the things themselves. And anything that breaks the isolation, even a comment from someone I'll never meet, helps more than I could have predicted before I needed it to. It was Faraz who finally said, about 3 months after that night, the thing that none of us had said out loud yet, which was, I think we were supposed to be in that Nala. And Arjun and I received this statement differently. Arjun argued against it on the grounds that we don't live in a universe where things are supposed to happen in that sense, that things happen and we narrate meaning onto them after the fact. And I said, I think I remember thinking exactly that when I saw the figures in the back seat, that it was a potential version of the night rather than a prescription. And Faraz said, maybe it's the same thing. And Arjun said, for fuck's sake, Faraz. And Faraz did something I had never seen Faraz do before, which was smile in a way that had sadness all the way to the back of it and said, I know, but I wanted to say it once, out loud so that we'd all heard it said.
Because I think we've all been thinking it and not saying it, and I think not saying things is what got us into this in the first place. And I thought about my sister, and about the thing I'd never told anyone, and I thought about how long I'd been carrying the weight of something I couldn't share, and how that particular silence had perhaps made me permeable to things I should have been more defended against.
And I said, "You're probably right." And Arjun said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "Okay, so what do we do with that?" And none of us had a good answer to that. The three of us are still friends, which is something I wasn't certain about for a while after that night, because experiences that intense do one of two things to relationships. They either forge them into something stronger, or they break them under the strain. And for the first few months, I genuinely didn't know which way ours would go, because there were weeks when none of us contacted each other, and those weeks had a quality of dread to them that was different from ordinary drift. It felt like avoidance, like each of us was a reminder to the others of something they were trying not to think about. And that's a difficult dynamic to maintain a friendship through, using the people you love most as triggers for your worst experiences. But we've gotten better at it, or we've at least gotten better at being around each other without the trigger being constantly activated, which is maybe the same thing or maybe isn't, but it's what we have, and I'm grateful for it in a way that I wasn't always capable of being grateful for things, now that I think about it carefully. And I want to be transparent about this, as I've tried to be transparent about everything. I'm not entirely certain about some of the physical details of that night in the way that I was initially certain about them, and I don't mean the essential events. I'm certain about the essential events, the road and the bridge and the navigation voice and the phone call and the ambassador and the figures. I'm certain about those, but some of the surrounding details have become less fixed over time in the way that memories do when they've been revisited and reconstructed many times. And I know, for instance, that I've described the Nala as perhaps 8 or 10 meters wide, but I've also described it at other times as narrower and at other times as wider. And I've described the ambassador as white, but there's a version of the memory where it's more of a pale gray, and these inconsistencies bother me, not because they undermine the essential account, but because they make me aware of how much of what I'm telling you is memory and how much of memory is reconstruction, and that awareness is uncomfortable in a very particular way because it means I can't be the definitive witness to my own experience. I can only give you my best reconstruction of what happened, and acknowledge that reconstruction has a margin of error I can't precisely quantify. Please tell me if any of this has happened to you.
I mean that. I've said it before, and I'll say it again here, because I think it's important to say it as directly as I can. If you have driven somewhere at night and found yourself in a situation that felt wrong in the specific way I've described, if you've heard a navigation voice say something that it shouldn't have been able to say, if you've seen something in a car or by a road that shouldn't have been there, if you felt that particular sensation of a situation having been prepared for your arrival rather than you having arrived at the situation, please tell me, because I need to know whether what happened to us was specific to us or whether it's part of something larger that operates in spaces like that, at the edges of cities, in the dark between one known place and the next, in the space that exists between where you are and where you were headed, and where something else entirely wanted you to go. I still don't understand what would have happened if we'd answered that call before we stopped at the bridge, if we'd answered it when the number first appeared during the drive, rather than after we'd already stopped, whether the voice would have said something different, whether it would have warned us about the road before we turned onto it rather than after. And I think about that alternate version of the night sometimes, the version where the phone rings 10 minutes earlier, and I answer it, and the voice says something that makes Arjun pull over and turn around before we ever reach the bridge. And in that version of the night, we never see the ambassador, and we never see the figures, and we go home, slightly disturbed by a strange phone call, but otherwise intact. And I wonder sometimes if that was the version that was being attempted, if the call had rung earlier, and I hadn't answered it in time, and the intervention had to escalate, and if those three who died in the Nala 30 years ago were trying to help us with the only tools they had available to them, and if the terrifying form of the help was a limitation of their situation, rather than a choice. And I find I can't explain it, but that interpretation, the interpretation of the ambassador and the figures as help rather than harm, is simultaneously comforting and the most frightening thing I can think about. Because it means that what I saw in the back seat of that car was not a threat, but a gift. And the next question that follows from that is what I was supposed to do with it. Looking back now across all of it,
The night and the weeks after and the hospital and the months of quiet ongoing strangeness. I think the thing that I've learned, if learning is what this is that the world has spaces in it that operate outside the logic I was raised to expect everything to operate inside, and that those spaces are not uniformly malevolent, that some of them are maintained by something like care or like love or like obligation, that whatever persists in places like that broken bridge and that dry nala persists because it's unfinished, rather than because it's malicious, because something happened in a moment and the moment couldn't close.
And that the white ambassador and its headlights and the navigation voice saying, "Se de Jiao," were all expressions of a persistence that was trying to find language for what it needed to say, and that what it needed to say was simple, and had been simple all along, which was not go straight but stop, and that the misdirection and the terror and the strangeness were just the limitations of the medium, just the ambassador's equivalent of a bad phone connection, of trying to say something important through a channel that wasn't designed for the message. I should have known when I chose to move away from my city after the hospital that I wasn't moving away from any of it, that the things that had attached themselves to my experience of that night didn't care about geography, that they had found some way of traveling with me that had nothing to do with physical proximity. And I don't mean this in a frightening way, or I don't mean it only in a frightening way, because some of what has followed me here has been frightening and some of it has been something else, something that on certain very quiet nights I'm almost tempted to call company. And I want to be careful about that word. I want to be clear that I'm not saying I've made peace with any of this or that I've achieved some enlightened perspective on what happened. I'm saying that the ongoing nature of it has become familiar in the way that anything does when it's consistent enough, and that familiarity, while not comfort, is at least something I can operate within, something I can build a life around and through, and despite, which is probably the most I can ask for given the alternative. Thanks for staying with this far. I know it's been a long account, and I know that not all of it holds together as neatly as a proper story would, and I want to acknowledge that the messiness of it is part of what makes me believe it. Because the clean version of this would be easier to tell and easier to hear and considerably less frightening. And what I've tried to do is give you the real version, even where the real version is uncertain and gapped and contradictory and dependent on the testimony of someone whose reliability as a witness to his own experience is genuinely in question. Because I think that's what this kind of thing deserves. Not the clean narrative, but the actual experience with all its rough edges intact. And if some of those rough edges have snagged on you in a way that's uncomfortable, I'm sorry. Though I'm also not sorry, because I think being snagged is the appropriate response to this. I think a clean story about this night would actually be a kind of lie, a prettying up of something that was and remains fundamentally unpretty. I want to end by telling you the thing that came to me recently, the thing that arrived the way realizations sometimes do, not as a thought I was thinking, but as something I noticed had already become true, without my being conscious of the process, which is this: that the three of us in the back seat of the ambassador in our clothes were not a warning about what would happen to us if we went straight. They were a memory of what had happened to three people just like us 30 years ago. And the ones who died in the Nala had been just like us, had been three friends in a car at night arguing about music and talking about food and being young and specific and alive, and what the ambassador was showing us was not our future, but their past, was saying here, look at what was lost here, look at what was young and specific and alive and then wasn't, and that recognition, that the horror of that night was at its core, not a supernatural threat, but a memorial, is simultaneously the thing that gives me most peace and the thing that makes me saddest when I let myself sit with it. Because three young men died in a Nala on a broken bridge, and 30 years later, they were still trying to make sure it didn't happen again, and that's either the most frightening thing I've ever heard or the most human thing I've ever heard. And I find I can't explain it, I genuinely cannot, but I think it might be both. Author's note. I want to tell you why I wrote this, and I want to do it honestly, rather than performing the kind of modest deflection that writers sometimes use when they're asked about the personal content of their work. Because I think the honest answer is more interesting than the deflected one. I grew up in a family that moved cities 3 times before I was 15, which means I spent a significant portion of my childhood in cars on unfamiliar roads at night, navigating toward places I'd never been. And there's something about that particular experience, the liminal quality of a road at night between one known place and the next,
that has stayed with me in a way that other childhood memories haven't. The specific fear in this story. The fear of following directions towards something that isn't what it appears to be. The fear of the guiding voice that leads you somewhere you shouldn't go is the fear of a child who has sat in back seats watching roads he doesn't recognize unspool in the dark, trusting that the adults driving know where they're going, and that trust is never entirely comfortable, even when it's warranted. I think I've always been drawn to horror that takes ordinary anxiety and extends it past its comfortable limits, and the anxiety of following a navigation app down a road you don't know in a direction you can't verify is a very contemporary version of a very ancient fear. The fear of the path that leads you where you weren't trying to go. The deeper reason for writing this, the one that's harder to say, is about connection and isolation and the specific loneliness of having an experience that you can't share without being looked at with that particular mixture of pity and skepticism that makes you want to stop talking. I've had experiences in my life that I've kept to myself because the cost of sharing them seemed higher than the benefit, and I think a lot of people live this way, carrying things that are too strange or too painful or too ambiguous to bring into ordinary conversation, and I wanted to write something that gave that particular experience a form, that externalized the strangeness of having something inside you that doesn't fit the shape of everyday language. The three friends in this story are connected to each other, genuinely and deeply connected. But they still can't fully share what happened to them, not right away, not cleanly, not without the experience getting distorted in the translation, and I think that's true to how things like this work, that even when you have people who love you and who went through something with you, the individual experience of that something remains partly private and partly untranslatable, and that's lonely in a specific way that I wanted to try to name. I did research for this story that I won't fully describe here because some of it led me to things I'm still not certain how to process, but the basic outlines are these. There are real bridges in real places that have claimed real lives over the years, often the same bridges, multiple times. And people who study these patterns have proposed various explanations for why certain locations accumulate tragedy repeatedly, ranging from the engineering deficiencies of the structures themselves to the psychology of accident clustering to things that fall outside the explanatory frameworks I was raised to trust. I read accounts from emergency responders and from families of victims and from local historians, and what struck me across all of those accounts was how often the people who were there described feeling that something was wrong before anything had gone wrong in the concrete observable sense, that the approach to these places had a quality to it that was hard to name, but that survivors retrospectively identified as a warning they hadn't known how to read. That pattern, the warning that arrives as a physical sensation before it can be articulated as a thought, was something I wanted to take seriously in this story. To treat it, not as a dramatic device, but as an actual aspect of how human beings relate to danger, and whether you attribute that to supernatural awareness or to evolved threat detection operating below the threshold of consciousness, I think the experience of it is real and deserves to be written about honestly. What scares me most about this story is the navigation voice, and I want to tell you why. We live in a time when we have essentially outsourced our spatial awareness to devices, when we get into cars and follow voices without knowing where we're going or how to get there independently. And this represents a kind of trust that we've extended to technology without fully thinking through what it means to trust something implicitly, to follow a directing voice without question. And I think there's something in the human psyche that is very vulnerable to direction, that wants to be told where to go and will follow that direction with an obedience that can override the physical signals of the environment we're moving through. The horror of go straight while looking at a broken bridge is the horror of the voice we've trained ourselves to trust, telling us to do the thing that will kill us. And whether the voice is a glitch or a ghost or something stranger than either, the human response to it, the moment of hesitation before disobeying it, is something I find genuinely frightening about us as a species. We will hesitate before disobeying a GPS. That's what we've become, and I don't think we've fully reckoned with what that means. What I want you to understand about this story, the thing I most want to leave with you, is that the three who are warning and the three who are warned are not opposites. They're reflections, and the white ambassador on the road is not the enemy. It's the evidence of something that should not have happened and that has been refusing for 30 years to simply be over. The persistence of horror is often the persistence of unfinished love, of connection that was interrupted before it could complete itself, of care that was still in motion when the motion was stopped. And I think that's true in life beyond story, that the things that haunt us are usually not malevolent but incomplete. Not trying to destroy us, but trying to finish something. And the terror of them comes from the fact that we don't have a form for that kind of communication, that what the dead have to say doesn't fit into the language of the living, and so it arrives as strangeness and wrongness, and the particular horror of things being not quite what they should be. If I have a hope for this story, it's that it leaves you slightly less afraid of the strange and slightly more curious about what it might be trying to say, while also absolutely never driving down an unfamiliar Kacha Rasta at night on the word of a navigation app. Please, please don't do that. Take it from someone who has spent months processing what can happen when you do. And if you've had your own experience with roads at night and directions that took you somewhere you didn't expect, something that you've kept to yourself because you didn't think anyone would believe you or because the telling of it seemed to make it more real in a way you weren't ready for, I want you to know that I'm asking genuinely. I'm not asking rhetorically or performatively. When I say, tell me, I want to hear it. I think these things need to be said out loud and heard by other people, even when they're strange, especially when they're strange, because the isolation of carrying a strange thing alone is worse than the thing itself, and we don't have to be alone in this if we're willing to speak. I think I remember, now that I've written all of this out and read it back, that the navigation was on Arjun's phone that night, not mine, and that my phone shouldn't have been involved in the navigation at all, and that therefore the call that came through on my phone from the navigation voice could not have originated from the application on Arjun's device by any mechanism I understand. And it occurs to me, only now sitting here with this written account in front of me, that if the call didn't come from the app and didn't come from any registered number and didn't appear in the carrier's records, then I have no idea what made it. None at all. And that gap, that particular gap that I'd somehow managed not to look at directly for all these months, is the one that opens the floor beneath me every time I get close to it. And I'm close to it now, and the cold water feeling is rising. And my phone is sitting face down on the desk next to me, because I can't look at the screen right now, and somewhere in the back of my head that is becoming harder and harder to ignore, there is the beginning of a sound like a ringtone playing at the wrong frequency, and I have not decided yet whether I'm going to answer it. I think I remember the exact moment when everything changed, and it wasn't the moment I heard Arian's voice calling from upstairs, and it wasn't even the moment I felt those small fingers wrapping around the hem of my dupatta from behind me in the kitchen. But rather it was the moment I turned around and saw my son's face in the dim yellow light under the kitchen table. That particular moment when his eyes met mine, and I saw something in them that no 5-year-old's eyes should ever contain, which was a depth of terror so ancient and so absolute that it made my stomach drop straight through the floor and my hands go cold and useless at my sides. Because in that moment I understood with a horrible clarity that the voice I had heard calling from upstairs was not my son's voice, and that whatever had been using my son's voice was still up there in our home, on the second floor of the house, where I had lived for 11 years and raised my child and thought myself safe. And looking back now, I cannot fathom how I had spent even a single moment of those preceding weeks feeling anything resembling safety in that house, because the signs had been there for so long, and I had chosen not to see them, or perhaps I had been made not to see them. And I still don't understand which of those two possibilities frightens me more when I lie awake at 3 in the morning and turn the whole thing over and over in my mind like a stone with something awful living underneath it. Let me try to explain how we came to live in that house, because I think the house itself is the beginning of everything. And I think the house chose us in some way that I still don't have language for even now. Years after we escaped it. Years after I sat in a government hospital waiting room with Arian sleeping across my lap and my husband Vikram pacing the linoleum floor with his hands pressed against his temples.
Years after the police came and the social workers came and the doctors came, and each of them looked at me with that particular expression of professional concern that is really just a very refined form of disbelief, and I can't explain it, but I knew from the moment I first saw that house that something about it was watching me, that it was taking note of me the way a predator takes note of something that has wandered into its territory, and that the warmth I felt toward it was not my own feeling, but something that was being fed into me like a drug through a needle, something sweet and artificial and deeply wrong. The house was in a colony on the outskirts of Lucknow, not quite city and not quite countryside, one of those neighborhoods that developed in the 90s when the city began expanding and families moved outward, looking for space and quiet and a certain kind of respectability that comes with having a proper house with a small garden and a boundary wall and neighbors who mind their own business. And the house had been empty for about 14 months before we moved in, which should have told me something, but which I rationalized away because the landlord, a man named Mr. Kapoor, who communicated almost entirely through his son-in-law because Mr. Kapoor himself seemed to find sustained conversation physically uncomfortable, gave us a reduced rent that we could not afford to turn down, given that Vikram's business had been struggling for the better part of 2 years, and we were in the kind of quiet desperation that you don't admit to your relatives or your neighbors, but that follows you into every room like a shadow. If I'm being honest, and I want to be honest because that is the only thing I have left to offer anyone at this point, I was also running from something when we moved to that house, and that something was the memory of what had happened to my younger sister Priya when we were children, and I had never told anyone about that, not even Vikram. And I think my silence about it was a crack in my foundation that whatever lived in that house was able to find and work its fingers into until the crack became something much larger. Because the thing about trauma that nobody tells you is that it doesn't just live in your mind, it lives in the space around you. It creates a kind of frequency that certain things can locate and track, the way a dog tracks scent, and whatever was in that house found my frequency immediately and knew exactly what to do with it. I had never told anyone about Priya because it's the kind of thing that sounds completely implausible when you say it out loud, and I've learned over the years that some people will accept the story, while others will look at you with a mixture of pity and skepticism that makes you want to stop talking immediately. So I kept it to myself, and I think that's part of why I was so vulnerable to what started happening in that house, because I was already carrying this weight of something I couldn't share with anyone. And looking back now, I realize that my silence about that past event made me susceptible to whatever influence began working on me in those walls. What happened to Priya is something I will come back to, because I believe it is directly connected to everything else I'm going to tell you. But for now, I'll just say that she disappeared from our family home in Allahabad when she was 7 years old and I was 12, and that she was found 3 days later in a room of the house that had been locked from the outside the entire time, and that when she came out of that room, she was not quite the same Priya who had gone in, and that the family dealt with this by not dealing with it at all, which is the particular genius of Indian families in crisis. This incredible collective capacity to build a wall of normalcy around something deeply abnormal, and then convince yourself and everyone around you that the wall is the truth and the thing behind it never happened. The first months in the Lucknow house were fine, or they seemed fine, which I now understand is not the same thing at all, and I was so relieved to have a proper home again, and so busy with the logistics of settling in and getting Aryan into a new school and helping Vikram stabilize his business that I didn't pay attention to the small things that should have made me uncomfortable. The way the upstairs hallway always felt colder than the rest of the house, regardless of the season. The way Aryan would sometimes stop playing and look up at the ceiling with an expression of concentrated attention, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. The way our dog Biscuit, a 6-year-old Labrador who had never shown aggression in his entire pampered life, began refusing to go beyond the ground floor and would sit at the bottom of the staircase, making a low sound in his throat that was not quite barking and not quite whining, but something between the two that made the hair on my arm stand up every time I heard it, and the way I would occasionally catch a smell in certain parts of the house that reminded me, inexplicably, of the locked room in our Allahabad home, a smell like old water and something sweeter underneath it. Something that made me think of the word decay, even though nothing in the house was decaying as far as I could tell. I should have known, is the thing. I should have known from all of those small
Signs that something was wrong, but knowing and acting on knowing are two entirely different operations for the human brain, and the human brain is extraordinarily good at protecting itself from knowledge it finds too threatening to integrate. And my brain had years of practice at this particular skill because of everything that had happened with Priya, and so I looked at all of those small wrongnesses and I found explanations for each of them individually, and I never allowed myself to look at them all together, because looking at them all together would have required me to reach a conclusion I wasn't ready to reach. Aryan started at his new school in August, and for the first few weeks he seemed happy enough, or as happy as a 5-year-old can seem when he's been uprooted from everything familiar and dropped into a new environment where he doesn't know anyone and where the teachers are strangers and the routines are different from the ones he's grown up with. And I would walk him to school every morning and pick him up every afternoon, and he would tell me about his day in the fragmented, tangential way that small children narrate their experiences, jumping from one detail to another without apparent logical connection. And I would listen and ask questions and feel that particular fierce love for him that sometimes feels indistinguishable from fear. The love that is always aware of how fragile the thing you love is and how many things in the world can harm it. That particular moment, that particular school pickup in the 3rd week of September, is one I keep returning to because I think it was the first time I heard something genuinely wrong. The first time my instincts registered something as a threat, even though my mind immediately found a way to explain it away. And what happened was this. I was waiting outside the school gate with the other parents when Aryan came running out, and I noticed as he reached me that his school bag was unzipped and his water bottle was missing. And I asked him where his bottle was, and he said in a completely normal voice that his friend had taken it. And I asked him which friend because he hadn't mentioned any friends yet, and he said, very matter-of-factly, the way children say things that they think are obvious, the one who comes to my room at night. And then he immediately started talking about something he had drawn in art class, and I couldn't get him to return to the subject of the night visitor, no matter how carefully I tried to raise it again without alarming him. And I told myself he was probably talking about an imaginary friend because 5-year-olds have imaginary friends, because that is a completely normal developmental stage, because there was absolutely no reason to believe that anything was actually coming into his room at night, because I was the one who locked the front door every evening and checked the windows, and I would have heard if someone had entered the house. And I can't explain it. But even as I was going through all of these reassuring thoughts, I knew on some level that exists below conscious thought that the explanation I was constructing was made of paper, and that the thing it was supposed to contain was considerably more substantial than paper. The woman who had brokered our rental agreement, whose name was Mrs. Srivastava, and who worked for a small property agency that operated out of a single-room office on Hazrat Ganj, had mentioned something about the previous tenant leaving rather abruptly, and when I had asked her what she meant by that, she had suddenly become very quiet and changed the subject with the professional smoothness of someone who had changed this particular subject before, steering the conversation toward the size of the kitchen and the good natural light in the upstairs rooms. And I remember thinking that was strange at the time, but I didn't push it because I was so desperate for the house, so relieved to have found something we could afford in a neighborhood that didn't make my skin crawl with its inadequacy. And now I wonder what she wasn't telling me, and whether she knew something that would have made me reconsider the whole arrangement if she had just been honest with me, instead of letting me walk into whatever this was completely unprepared. And every time I think about that conversation in her small office with the water-stained ceiling tiles and the photographs of properties on the wall, I get this sick feeling in my stomach, like she knew exactly what would happen to us, and she let it happen anyway. The previous tenant I later found out through a neighbor named Mrs. Pandy, who had lived on the same street for 30 years and who possessed that particular combination of excellent memory and total willingness to share information that is the defining characteristic of the ideal neighborhood informant, was a software engineer named Rajesh, who had lived in the house alone for 8 months before leaving so suddenly that he had reportedly abandoned several pieces of furniture and a refrigerator full of food. And Mrs. Pandey said that in his last weeks in the house, Rajesh had seemed very unwell, had lost considerable weight, and had taken to sitting in his car in the driveway for hours at a time in the evenings instead of going inside. And that she had spoken to him once during this period
and that he had said something to her that she had been reluctant to repeat, but which she eventually did repeat after sufficient encouragement and sufficient tea, which was that he believed something in the house had learned to imitate his voice and was using it to make phone calls that he had no memory of making. Vikram came home that evening, the evening of the day I had heard Aryan mention his nighttime visitor, and I tried to tell him about it in a way that communicated my unease without making me sound like I was spiraling into some kind of anxiety episode. Because Vikram is a kind man, but he is a thoroughly rational man in the way that many engineers are rational.
Which means that his instinct, when confronted with something he can't immediately explain, is to find the simplest, logical explanation for it, and then close the door on the subject with great firmness. And I knew before I even opened my mouth that he was going to tell me that imaginary friends were normal and that I was reading too much into a child's innocent remark. And he did say exactly those things, but he said them kindly. And he also said that if it would make me feel better, we could move the baby monitor back to Aryan's room, even though Aryan was 5 and probably too old for it now. And I said, yes, please. And that night I lay in bed listening to the static of the monitor on my side table and looking at the ceiling and thinking about Priya, about the 3 days she had been missing in our Allahabad house, about how she had been found in that locked room and how she had been perfectly physically unharmed, but somehow different afterward, in a way that nobody in the family had ever found adequate words for. And I think I was looking for some connection between that old memory and the new discomfort I was feeling, some way of understanding this present unease through the lens of that past experience. And I can't explain it, but I had the very strong feeling that the past and the present were not as separate as they appeared to be. That something was threading itself through both of those situations the way a needle threads through cloth, pulling them together with invisible stitching. I started waking up at odd hours, which was new for me because I have always been a sound sleeper. The kind of person who falls asleep within minutes and stays asleep until the alarm. And Vikram used to tease me about it in an affectionate way, saying I could sleep through an earthquake. And he was probably right. I had slept through Aryan's middle-of-the-night wakings when he was an infant far more often than I care to admit. But now I was waking at 2 in the morning, at 3, at 4, always in the same way. Not suddenly from a nightmare, but gradually. Like something was carefully peeling me out of sleep, the way you peel a label off a bottle, with patience and deliberation. And I would lie there in the dark bedroom with Vikram breathing beside me, and I would listen, though I couldn't have told you what I was listening for. And sometimes I would hear nothing, and sometimes I would hear the house settling, the small creaks and sighs that old buildings make. And once, very clearly, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the hallway outside our bedroom door. Light footsteps with the particular weight of a small child, and I got up and opened the door and the hallway was empty, and I went to Aryan's room and he was asleep in his bed, looking perfectly peaceful with one arm around his stuffed elephant, and I stood there in the doorway watching him breathe for a long time, before I went back to bed and lay there in the dark, with my heart doing something complicated and irregular in my chest. I should have known even then. I should have known that whatever was making those footsteps was not my son, because my son was in his bed. I had seen him with my own eyes, and whatever had been walking in the hallway had been somewhere else, something else. Walking with a small child's weight in my house in the middle of the night, and I still don't understand how I managed to convince myself that I had simply been mistaken about the footsteps, that I had imagined them in the half-dreaming state between sleep and waking, that there was an entirely ordinary explanation for everything, and I was just an anxious mother in a new house working myself up over nothing. The school called in October to tell me that Aryan had been involved in a minor incident in the playground, not a fight exactly, but something that had alarmed one of the teachers enough to report it to the principal. And when I went in to speak with the principal, a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Mehta, who had the carefully neutral expression of someone who has learned through long professional experience to deliver difficult information without alarming parents more than is absolutely necessary, she told me that Aryan had been observed speaking to another child in a voice that didn't sound like his own voice, that the teacher who had overheard this had described the alternate voice as lower and somehow wrong in a way she had found difficult to articulate, and that the other child, a 4-year-old boy named Kaushik, had become very upset and had cried and refused to say what Arian had said to him in this altered voice, and Mrs. Maida asked me gently whether Arian had perhaps been watching inappropriate content on a device at home, whether there was anything unusual going on in the family that might explain this behavior. And I sat in that chair across from her desk and thought about the footsteps in the hallway, and about Arian's nighttime visitor, and about the smell in the upstairs corridor that reminded me of the locked room in Allahabad. And I said that everything was fine at home and that I would speak with Arian, and I smiled the smile of a mother who is managing the situation competently. And I got up and drove home and sat in the car in the driveway for 20 minutes, with both hands on the steering wheel, which I now realize was exactly what the previous tenant Rajesh had apparently done in those last weeks when he was trying to find the courage to go back inside. And the worst part was that as I sat there, I thought, quite clearly, I am doing the same thing he did. And then I went inside anyway. I want to ask you something, and I want you to take it seriously before you read any further. Have you ever felt as though a house was aware of you? Not in the metaphorical way people sometimes talk about old buildings having atmosphere or character, but genuinely, literally aware, the way another person is aware of you, watching you move through its rooms with attention and intention, learning your patterns and your routines and your weaknesses, the way a hunter learns the habits of its prey. Because I know that sounds like the kind of thing a person says when they're either writing a horror story or having a breakdown, and I understand completely if that's how it sounds to you. And I wouldn't blame you for that reaction, because I would have had exactly the same reaction if someone had said it to me before any of this happened. But I am asking you genuinely, and I want you to think carefully about any house you've ever lived in that felt wrong in some way you couldn't explain. Because I think this experience is more common than people admit, and I think the reason people don't admit it is the same reason I spent months in that house not admitting what I knew, which is that admitting it means accepting the existence of something that fundamentally upends your understanding of the world and your place in it, and most of us would rather feel like we are going crazy than accept that the world is actually shaped differently from what we have always been told. By November, Arian had stopped talking about his nighttime visitor, and at first I thought this meant the imaginary friend phase had passed, as these things apparently do pass. And I felt a cautious relief about it, but then I noticed that what he had stopped doing was not imagining a friend but talking to me, and that there was something in the quality of his silence that was not the comfortable silence of a child who is preoccupied with his own inner world, but something more careful, more watchful. The silence of a child who has been told not to mention something, or who has decided on his own that certain subjects are not safe to raise with certain people. And that particular distinction is one I know from my own childhood. I know exactly what it looks and feels like in a child, because I was that child. After Priya came back from the locked room, I was the child who knew something and had decided that the knowledge was too dangerous to share. And recognizing that quality in Arian's silence was like finding the same handwriting in two different documents and realizing they were written by the same hand, and it made me feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the November temperature. I tried to talk to him about school, about his drawings, about the television programs he liked, and he would respond to all of these things normally and warmly. He would climb into my lap and lean his head against my chest the way he had done since he was a baby. And in those moments, I would hold him very tight and breathe in the smell of his hair and tell myself that he was fine. That whatever I thought was happening was not happening. That I was creating a crisis out of nothing because I was anxious and sleep-deprived and still not fully settled in a new city. And looking back now, I understand that those moments of holding him were also the moments when whatever had established itself in our house was most comfortable, because I was not looking, I was not watching. I was too busy feeling relieved to notice what was actually happening. It didn't make sense until much later, until after everything had resolved itself, or rather shattered itself into something that could no longer be denied. But I began to notice around this time that there were small inconsistencies in Arian's behavior that I kept categorizing as normal childhood variability when I should have been looking at them as a pattern, and the inconsistency that I keep returning to when I try to reconstruct the timeline of events is this. There were moments when Arian seemed to forget things he absolutely knew, things so basic and so long established in his little life that forgetting them made no sense. And then there were moments when he seemed to know things he couldn't possibly have known.
And both of these things happened with the same casual confidence, as if the forgetting and the knowing were equally natural to him, as if he was not aware of the contradiction between the two. And I remember one specific afternoon when I was making chai in the kitchen and Arian came in and stood next to me at the counter in that companionable way he had, his small hands on the edge of the counter and his chin barely reaching the surface. And he asked me very seriously what my father's name was, and I was surprised because he absolutely knew his Nana's name. He had been calling him by his nickname since he was 2 years old. And when I told him the name, he repeated it slowly and carefully like he was committing it to memory for the first time. And then he asked what my mother's name was, and then what my sister's name was, and when I said Priya's name, I saw something happen in his face, something very quick, a kind of flicker of interest or recognition that was there and gone in less than a second. And I think I stopped breathing for a moment before I made myself exhale and asked him casually if he knew who Priya Mausi was, and he said, in a perfectly ordinary voice, that Priya Mausi was the one who got lost in the room. And there is no way he knew that. There is absolutely no way my 5-year-old son knew what had happened to my sister in our Allahabad home, because I had never told anyone, not Vikram, not my parents, not any of our relatives. The family secret had stayed a secret, locked behind that same wall of collective silence that the family had constructed around the locked room. And yet Arian knew. And when I asked him how he knew, he just shrugged with the magnificent indifference of a 5-year-old and went back to whatever he had been doing before. And I stood at the kitchen counter with my hands shaking and the chai boiling over behind me and thought for the first time with real clarity, something is very wrong in this house. I tried to look up the history of the property after that, because knowing about the previous tenant from Mrs. Pandey had been useful, and I thought there might be other things to know that I wasn't currently aware of. And what I found, after some research that involved visiting the municipal records office and speaking with a very elderly records clerk who had an encyclopedic memory of the neighborhood, was that the house had a longer and stranger history than I had imagined. That it had been built in 1962 on land that had previously been part of a larger estate, and that the original owner's family had left it after only a few years because of what the records clerk described, with the careful language of a man who has learned to transmit information without taking responsibility for its implications as domestic disturbances of an unusual nature, and that subsequently, the house had had a series of short-term occupants, with an average residence of less than 2 years each. Which is an extraordinary statistic for a well-constructed house in a decent neighborhood in a city where housing is not plentiful, and that there had been one incident in 1989 that appeared in the local police records, not as a crime exactly, but as an unexplained event, and which the records clerk would not elaborate on beyond saying that it had involved a child and had been resolved without injury, and he said the words, "without injury," with a particular emphasis that suggested the resolution had not been entirely satisfactory in other respects. And I left that office with my notes in my bag and walked to my car in the bright afternoon sunlight and sat there for a while, looking at the ordinary busy street and thinking about children and about rooms and about what it means to be resolved without injury when the injury in question is not to the body. There was a man I passed on the road during my 3rd week of November, or maybe it was the 4th week. I'm less certain about the timing of this than I am about most other things, and I can't explain it, but something about him was profoundly unsettling in a way I've never been able to adequately describe to anyone. And when our eyes met for just a moment, I felt this overwhelming sense of recognition. Like I had seen him before somewhere, but not in this life, or not in this version of my life, or something like that. Something impossible to articulate precisely. And he didn't say anything. He just sort of tilted his head very slightly, like he was studying me, or like he was confirming something he had already suspected. And I never saw him again after that single encounter. But I think about him constantly, and I'm terrified to know what he meant or what his role was in whatever was happening to our family. And sometimes I wonder if that moment was the actual beginning of everything, or if it was just the moment when I finally became aware of something that had already been operating for a long time. He was an older man, perhaps 65, wearing a kurta that was unremarkable, except that it seemed oddly clean for someone walking along a dusty roadside. and his hair was entirely white, and his face was deeply lined, and his eyes were very dark and very still. And the quality of his attention when he looked at me was unlike anything I have experienced before or since. It was like being looked at by something that knew you completely, that had studied you from a distance for a long time before this moment of direct contact, and the whole encounter lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it made my legs go weak and I had to stop walking for a moment, and by the time I turned to look back at him, he was gone. Not around a corner, but simply gone. Vanished from a straight stretch of road with no turnings where he could have disappeared to in 3 seconds. And I stood on that road for a long time before I made my feet move again. The phone calls started in December, and for a while I thought they were wrong numbers because the number calling was unfamiliar, and when I answered there was no voice on the other end, just a quality of silence that was somehow different from an empty line. A silence that felt occupied, if that makes any sense to you. A silence with something listening at the center of it, and after the 3rd or 4th call I stopped answering, but the calls kept coming, sometimes several in one day, and I started checking the call log, and there were dozens and dozens of calls that I had no memory of occurring, and I honestly couldn't tell if they had happened while I was asleep or if I was blocking the memory out because my mind couldn't handle what was really going on. And the worst part was that at some point I realized the calls were getting closer together. Like whatever was on the other end was getting more insistent or more desperate or maybe more angry at my continued refusal to pick up. And I've tried to retrieve those call logs since leaving the house, but they're completely gone, like they were never there at all. And the phone itself behaved strangely, around this time in other ways too, losing charge faster than it should have, displaying messages that disappeared before I could read them fully. And once, very late at night when I was alone in the kitchen, playing a recording through its speaker that sounded exactly like Arian's voice saying my name in a way that Arian's voice had never actually sounded, too low, too deliberate. The way you would hear a child's voice in a nightmare rather than the way an actual child speaks in actual daylight. I showed Vikram the call log the following morning, and he frowned at it and said the calls were probably from a telemarketer who had flagged my number, and I said that telemarketers don't call at 2 and 3 in the morning. And he agreed that this was unusual, but suggested I contact the phone company to block the number. And I tried to block the number and found that every time I blocked it, the calls continued from the same number, as though the blocking had done nothing at all. And I called the phone company and spoke to a customer service representative who looked into my account and then went very quiet for a moment before saying that she couldn't see any record of calls from that number in my log. That as far as the company's system was concerned, the calls had not occurred. And I said they were right there in my call history, and she said she understood that, but that she could not see them on her end. And the conversation ended with both of us in a state of polite mutual incomprehension that I found far more frightening than an argument would have been. It was the 14th of December, and I remember the date specifically because it was 2 days before Arian's school winter break was due to begin. That, I found the photograph. I had been repainting the master bedroom, or rather I had been making a start on repainting it because I had finally decided to do something about the color, which was a grayish beige that made the room feel like the inside of an overcast afternoon. And I had begun to strip away the old wallpaper before applying the new paint, and it was behind the wallpaper, in the section of wall between the window and the wardrobe, that I found it, tucked between the plaster and the paper as though it had been deliberately hidden there. A black and white photograph, perhaps 6 inches by 4 inches, of a group of 8 or 9 people standing in front of the house. And the house was clearly this house, recognizable from the shape of the doorway and the particular angle of the boundary wall. And the photograph looked as though it had been taken sometime in the 1960s, based on the clothing and the quality of the image. And there was one woman standing in the back row who made me feel as though the floor was tilting beneath me, because she looked remarkably similar to how I look now. Not identical. Not a perfect copy, but similar in a way that went beyond coincidence. Similar in the way that you are sometimes similar to an ancestor in an old family photograph. The same bone structure, the same set of the shoulders, the same particular way of standing slightly angled to the camera rather than directly facing it. And there was an old photograph I found tucked behind the wallpaper in the master bedroom, and it showed a group of people standing in front of the cottage, taken probably 50 or 60 years ago, based on the style and the color of the photograph. And there was one woman in the back
who looked remarkably similar to how I look now, and I couldn't understand how that was possible unless I was losing my mind completely. And I kept that photograph for a while, but I was afraid to look at it too closely, because I somehow knew that if I looked at it for too long, I would begin to understand something about it that would fundamentally change how I understood my own existence, and eventually the photograph disappeared, or I destroyed it. I am no longer entirely certain which, and I still don't understand what that woman was doing in a photograph taken in front of this house in the 1960s, wearing my face. I called my mother that evening, something I had been avoiding doing for several weeks, because my mother has that particular maternal radar for distress that sees straight through any attempt at casualness. And I didn't want her to worry, but I needed to ask her something specific, and I needed to ask it indirectly enough that it didn't alarm her.
And what I asked, after about 15 minutes of ordinary conversation, was whether she remembered anything specific about the room in the Allahabad house, the locked room where Priya had been found, whether she remembered anything unusual about it, any history it might have had. And my mother was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that she didn't want to talk about that, and I said I understood, but I needed to know, and she was quiet again. And then she said, in a voice I hadn't heard her use since I was a child, and which meant she was speaking the truth she normally kept locked away, that the room had been the nursery of the woman who had built the house, and that this woman's child had died in that room, and that the family had always said afterward that the room was not right, that it had a hunger to it, and that what happened to Priya was not the first time something like it had happened in that room. And then she stopped and said she had to go and hung up, and I stood in the kitchen of the Lucknow house, holding my phone and thinking about hunger, about hungry rooms, about the possibility that certain spaces develop an appetite that they then spend decades or centuries attempting to satisfy, and thinking about how two houses in two different cities both seem to have this quality, and thinking about the photograph of the woman with my face and wondering what connected her to me across 50 years of time, and whether whatever that connection was had anything to do with the houses we had both apparently inhabited. And I know that some of you reading this might be thinking that I'm completely insane for believing what I'm telling you. And you might be right, and I wouldn't blame you for being skeptical, because this entire experience defies rational explanation, and I understand that, but I also know that I'm not the only person who has experienced something like this, and that's what terrifies me most, because if this is actually a real phenomenon that occurs to multiple people, then what does that say about the nature of reality and what we think we understand about how the world actually works? So if you've experienced something similar to what I'm describing, please reach out. Please tell me if this happened to you, because I need to know that I'm not alone in this. I need to know that there is some community of people who have walked through this particular darkness and come out on the other side with their sanity more or less intact. Because some days I'm not sure mine is, and some days I think the most honest thing I can say about myself is that I am a woman who survived something she doesn't fully understand and is still trying to figure out what surviving actually means. The change in Aryan became more visible in January, and by change I mean that the inconsistencies I had been cataloging for months began to coalesce into something more definitive, something harder to dismiss or rationalize or file away under the category of normal child behavior. And the thing that pushed it beyond deniability was his drawings, because Aryan had always loved to draw, and his drawings had always been the particular kind of cheerfully chaotic art that 5-year-olds produce, full of impossible proportions and vivid colors and the pure confident expressiveness of a child who hasn't yet learned to judge his own work. And I had a whole folder of them on the refrigerator and more in a drawer in the kitchen, and I loved them in the way you love evidence of your child's particular inner world. And then in January, the drawings changed, and I noticed the change gradually over the course of several days, so that I can't point to a single drawing and say, this was the moment, but what I can say is that by the end of the first week of January, the drawings no longer looked like a 5-year-old's work and no longer depicted the scenes that 5-year-olds typically draw. They no longer showed our family or our house or his school or the things he watched on television. They showed instead a series of images that I found deeply uncomfortable without being able to immediately articulate why. Images of a figure looking up at a house from the outside. Images of something in a hallway that was not quite human in its proportions. Images of a small child and a larger form standing very close together in a dark space. Images that showed a level of technical ability
that Arian simply did not have and that showed a perspective, an artistic perspective that was not a 5-year-old's perspective. And when I asked Arian about the drawings, he said his friend helped him. And when I asked which friend, he gave me a look that I still think about. A look that was simultaneously the perfectly ordinary expression of a child who finds a question mildly annoying and something else entirely.
Something too old and too knowing for that small face. And then he went back to drawing, without saying anything more. I noticed my reflection looked different one morning in February, and I don't mean that I looked tired or unwell, which I certainly did, but something else, something harder to define, and I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed about my face, but something about my eyes seemed darker, or maybe my skin seemed more pale. Or perhaps my features had shifted in some subtle way that no one else would notice, but that I could feel in my bones, and I didn't want to think about what that might mean. So I told myself it was the bathroom light, which was a weak fluorescent bulb that flatters no one, and I told myself I needed to eat better and sleep more and drink more water. But deep down, I knew something fundamental was changing in me, and I couldn't stop it, and I couldn't even articulate what it was that was happening. And looking back now, I think what was happening was that the thing in the house was not just learning to use Arian's voice. It was learning to use all of us, learning our bodies and our habits and our patterns, the way a musician learns an instrument, practicing with small movements before attempting something more complete. And by February, it had been in the house with us long enough that its presence had begun to leave marks on us the way water leaves marks on stone, gradual and cumulative, and ultimately structural. I started doing things I didn't remember deciding to do, going to certain parts of the house and not knowing why I had gone there. Standing in the upstairs hallway in the night with no memory of having gotten up. And once I found myself at the front door, with my hand on the latch in the middle of the afternoon with no idea why I was there, or whether I had been about to open the door from the inside or if I had perhaps been trying to make sure it was properly closed. And I looked at my hand on the latch for a long moment, and the hand looked familiar and strange at the same time, which is a feeling I can't explain but which I know exactly. And I said quietly to myself, or to whatever might have been listening, that this was my house, and my body and my family. And then I went and sat in the kitchen and made tea with both hands trembling and counted to 10 very slowly until the trembling stopped. I should have known that February was when things would escalate. Because in retrospect, the pattern is completely visible, the way these things often are in retrospect. The slow accumulation building towards something specific, but I was living inside it rather than observing it. From outside, and the inside perspective is always incomplete, always missing the shape of the whole, because you can only see the part you're standing in, and the part I was standing in felt like a particularly bad patch of an experience that was difficult throughout rather than a preparation for a crisis. And so I was caught off guard when Vikram came home on a Tuesday evening in mid-February and said that he had received a call that day from me, from my number, but that the person speaking had not been me. And when I asked him what he meant, he was quiet for a moment in the way he gets quiet when he is trying to find language for something he doesn't fully understand. And then he said that the voice had been mine. The voice had sounded exactly like me, but the things the voice had said were not things I would say, were not even things that followed a logic he could identify, were instead a series of statements about the house and about the children in the house and about a particular room that made no sense as a phone conversation, but that had stayed with him for the rest of the day because of the quality of wrongness in them. And I asked him what I had apparently said about the children in the house, and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, which was a mixture of fear and something like preemptive grief. And he said, "You said there would only be one child in the house, and that one would be enough." I told Vikram everything that night, which took several hours and required more tea than I would have thought possible, and ended with both of us sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning, with the evidence between us, the drawings, the notes I had taken, the photograph of the woman with my face that I had found, and then, I realized with a lurch, could no longer locate in the place I had put it. And I told him about the records office and what the clerk had said, and about Mrs. Pandy and the previous tenant, and about the phone calls I had been receiving. And I told him about Priya, which was the hardest part. The part that had been locked away for so long that saying it out loud felt like breaking something. And to his enormous credit, Vikram listened to all of it, without interrupting and without the expression of professional skepticism that I had been afraid of. And when I finished, he sat quietly for a moment and then he said, "For fuck's sake, Meena, why didn't you tell me any of this sooner?" And I said, "Because I didn't know how," and he said, "I know," and we sat with that between us for a while. The knowledge and the silence and the ordinary kitchen around us that felt less ordinary with every passing minute. We decided that night that we would leave, that we would find somewhere else to stay while we figured out what to do about the house and the lease and the practical logistics. And that decision felt right and felt possible. In the middle of the night at the kitchen table, with both of us awake and aligned and resolute.
And then the next morning came, and the decision felt different. Not wrong exactly, but less urgent. And I found that when I tried to think specifically about leaving, about where we would go and when we would go and how we would explain it to Aryan's school, the thoughts became slippery and hard to hold, like trying to grip something wet, and I noticed that Vikram seemed to be having the same difficulty, that his practical engineer's mind, that is normally excellent at logistics, was somehow unable to make progress on the specific question of leaving. And I still don't understand whether this was psychological, whether we were both so embedded in the situation that disrupting it felt impossible, or whether something in the house was actively working against our plan, making it harder to execute.
Keeping us inside the way a carnivorous plant keeps an insect inside, not with force, but with a kind of structural arrangement that makes exit progressively more difficult. We stayed for 2 more weeks, during which time I watched Aryan with the constant attention of a person who knows something is happening and is trying to catch the exact moment of it. And during those 2 weeks, he seemed perfectly normal, most of the time. My warm, funny, curious boy who loved trains and hated baths and could eat his weight in the mango ice cream that the corner shop near the school sold. And then there would be a moment, brief and shocking as a cold wave, when he would look at me, with eyes that held something too large for his 5-year-old self, something that was not him. And those moments were the worst part of all of it. Worse than the footsteps in the hallway, and worse than the phone calls, and worse than my own reflection looking back at me with darkness in its eyes, because those moments were happening to my child, and I couldn't stop them. The night it happened, the night that forced our hand and made leaving into something that we didn't so much decide as simply do, without planning and without logistics. I was in the kitchen making dinner, and Vikram was upstairs in his home office, and Aryan was in the sitting room watching television, or I thought he was watching television. I could hear the television from where I stood at the stove, the cheerful noise of a children's program that I recognized by sound, and I was cutting vegetables and thinking about tomorrow and feeling the ordinary small fatigue of a woman at the end of a day. And then I heard Aryan call from upstairs clearly and distinctly, from the direction of the upper floor. "Mummy, jaldi aao, come quickly, Mummy." And there was something in the voice that made me put down the knife immediately. A quality of urgency that sent adrenaline through me, before I had even processed what I was hearing. And I turned toward the kitchen door to go up, and that is the moment, that particular moment, when I felt small fingers close around the hem of my dupatta from behind me. Gentle and definitive, and I turned around slowly because I already knew what I was going to see, and I needed a moment before I saw it, and there was Aryan, my son, crouched under the kitchen table, in the small dark space between the table legs, and his face was the white of something that has been kept away from light for too long, and his eyes were very wide and very dark, and absolutely his own, absolutely the eyes of my child, and not the other thing that had been looking out of them sometimes. And he looked at me with those eyes, and he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, barely loud enough to make it across the space between us, "Mummy, upar mat jana. Don't go up, Mummy." And from upstairs, from where the voice was calling in a version of my son's voice that I now understood with complete and total clarity, was not my son's voice. The call came again, and this time there was something wrong with it, in a way I could finally hear openly. Finally hear without the protective layer of denial and rationalization that had been buffering my perception for months.
And what was wrong with it was that it was too smooth, too precise, a reproduction of the voice rather than the voice itself, like a recording of rain rather than actual rain, like a painting of fire rather than actual fire, like something that had studied the pattern of my son's voice and reproduced the pattern without understanding what made the pattern real. And the worst part was that it was getting it closer with every repetition, that it was learning and refining and improving with the patient precision of something that has all the time in the world and nothing better to do than practice. And I understood in that moment that if we stayed in this house much longer, the reproductions would become indistinguishable from the real thing, that eventually even I would not be able to tell the difference, that this was in fact the plan.
And that the plan had been in operation since long before we moved in. Perhaps since the woman with my face had lived here 50 years ago, perhaps longer. I made a choice in that moment that probably seems insane to anyone reading this, and I still can't fully explain why I did what I did, except that in the moment it felt like the only option available to me, even though there were obviously other choices I could have made. And I think what happened is that I had already crossed some threshold beyond which normal human decision-making no longer applied, because the situation had become so far removed from anything in my experience that my regular logic had simply stopped functioning in its usual way. And the choice I made was this. I did not call out to Vikram. I did not take Aryan and run for the front door. I did not do any of the things that seem obvious now from the outside. Instead, I pulled Aryan out from under the table, very carefully and very quietly, and I held him against me with both arms, and I walked not toward the door, but toward the bottom of the staircase, and I stood there and I said, loudly and clearly, into the upper floor of my house, into the dark of the hallway I could see the beginning of at the top of the stairs. I know you're there, and I know what you've been doing, and I know it's been going on for a long time, and you are going to leave this family alone. And then nothing happened for a moment that felt like it lasted several minutes. A silence so complete that I could hear Aryan's heartbeat against my chest. And then from upstairs came a sound that I have tried many times since to find words for, and still cannot quite succeed. A sound that was somehow both very familiar and completely alien. That was the recognizable voice of my son, shaped around something that was not my son's breath or my son's intention, and it said, in that voice, very quietly, "But I'm already here," and I think I remember the next few hours in fragments rather than continuously, which the doctors later told me was a normal response to acute trauma. The brain protecting itself by not storing the complete experience in a form that can be easily accessed. And what I have is a series of images rather than a sequence. Vikram's face when he appeared at the top of the stairs and I was screaming at him to come down immediately. The particular look of someone who has been pulled out of one reality into another without warning and has not yet caught up to where he is, and then Vikram beside me with his hand on my back and Aryan between us, and the three of us, moving toward the front door with a speed that had nothing casual about it, and the door opening, and the cold February night outside, and Biscuit, who had apparently been sitting at the front door for the past hour, preceding us onto the path with his tail very low and his head turned to look back at the house. And I remember looking back at the house too. I couldn't help it. I looked back at it from the gate, and every window was dark and nothing moved, and the house sat there in the winter night, looking perfectly ordinary, looking like any house, looking like exactly the kind of quiet, comfortable home I had been so grateful to find. And I think I remember saying something out loud, though I don't know who I was saying it to, maybe to the house, maybe to myself, and what I think I said was, I should have known. We went to Vikram's cousin's flat in another part of the city, arriving at 11 at night without calling ahead, which is the kind of arrival that requires explanation, and Vikram's cousin Anand, who is a good man with the particular pragmatic kindness of someone who has seen enough of life to not be excessively surprised by its emergencies, made up the guest room without asking many questions, and fed us tea and biscuits, and let Aryan fall asleep on the sofa, with Biscuit pressed against his legs. And the questions came in the morning, when Aryan was occupied in the other room and could not hear, and Vikram and I tried to explain what had happened, with the inadequate vocabulary of people who have experienced something that does not fit neatly into the available categories of explanation. And Anand listened with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and his expression shifting between concern and a carefully controlled skepticism,
that reminded me painfully of the expression I had been afraid Vikram would use when I told him. The expression that means I believe you are in distress, but I am not sure I believe the reason for it. And eventually Anand said that we could stay as long as we needed and that we should see a doctor and that he would call Mr. Kapoor's son-in-law in the morning to discuss the lease situation. And I could tell that the framing he was applying to the situation was one of stress and possible breakdown rather than one of haunting, and I was too tired to argue and too grateful for shelter to make it a point of contention. I woke up in the hospital, and I honestly don't know if I had been there for hours or days or weeks, because my sense of time had become completely distorted during the entire experience and continued to be distorted for some time afterward. And the doctors told me one story about what had happened, which was that I had had some kind of episode consistent with extreme stress and sleep deprivation, and possibly the early stages of something they described with clinical care as a dissociative condition, and their story didn't match any of my actual memories of the events. And I started to question whether my memories were real or whether they were some kind of elaborate hallucination that my mind had constructed to make sense of something that had actually happened, but in a completely different way. And to this day, I still don't know which version of events is the true one, and I'm not sure I ever will. And sometimes I wonder if the hospital was even real or if that was just part of the same experience. And sometimes I wonder about the other version of that night, the version where a woman under extreme stress heard a noise upstairs and had a panic attack in the kitchen and frightened her child and her husband. And I honestly cannot determine with certainty which of these two versions is the accurate description of what occurred. Which is perhaps the most frightening realization of all, because it means that the one thing I was absolutely certain of, which was my own experience, is the thing I can trust least. What I do know, what I keep returning to because it is a fact that both versions of events must accommodate, is that Aryan has not mentioned his nighttime visitor since we left the house, and that the drawings have gone back to the cheerful, chaotic art of a 5-year-old, and that Biscuit no longer makes that low sound in his throat, and that I have not heard my son's voice coming from a direction where my son is not. And these things are true, and they matter, and I hold on to them when everything else feels uncertain. Thanks for listening this far, genuinely, because this is not an easy thing to have heard, and it was not an easy thing to tell. And I want you to know that I am aware of how it sounds. I'm aware of the various frameworks through which a person could hear this account and reach conclusions about my mental state that are different from my own conclusions about it. And I'm not dismissing those frameworks. I'm really not, because I have to live with the uncertainty of not knowing which framework is correct, and I am trying to do that with some kind of grace, even though some days grace is in very short supply. We are living in a rented flat now, a second-floor flat, in a modern building in a part of Lucknow that feels relentlessly contemporary. All tinted windows and smooth plastered walls and electrical fittings that haven't had time to develop any particular atmosphere, and I chose it specifically for its newness, its total absence of history, its refusal to contain anything older than the certificate of occupancy, and it is pleasant and unremarkable, and I'm grateful for it in a way that I was never grateful for the cottage, with its stone walls and its ivy, and its windows looking out over the grounds, grateful for blandness, the way you are grateful for flat ground after a long period of uneven terrain. Aryan started at a new school in March and has made friends, real ones with names I recognize from his conversation and faces I have now met at the school gate. And he is becoming himself again, or perhaps he is becoming himself for the first time in a long while, the self that exists when nothing is interfering with it, and watching him become himself is the thing I am most grateful for in all of this. More grateful for it than for my own sanity or my marriage or any other thing, because he is 5 years old and the rest of his life is in front of him, and I would rather destroy every other thing I have than allow what happened in that house to touch the life that is in front of him. But even though I've left that place and I've tried to build some kind of normal life again, things still happen to me that I can't explain, and that remind me that whatever I experienced there didn't end when I left that house. And sometimes I'll catch myself doing something and I won't remember deciding to do it. Or I'll find myself in a room and have no memory of walking there. Or I'll look at my hands and they'll seem slightly unfamiliar to me. Not foreign exactly, but not entirely mine. And I know how insane this all sounds, but it's the truth. And the worst part is that I know it's still happening in some way that I don't have language for, some residue of what occurred in that house that is still active in me, the way a wound can be closed and healing and still periodically ache when the pressure is applied in the right place. And I wonder sometimes if the person writing this is even entirely the same person who moved into that house with such hope and such desperate relief, or if some part of that person is still there in those rooms and whatever it was that watched us move through that space and learned us from the inside out. And I'm not entirely sure how to think about that possibility or what to do with it. So mostly I just get up in the morning and make Arian's tiffin and drink my tea and drive him to school and come home and try to live the kind of life that is too ordinary for anything extraordinary to find interesting. And mostly this works, and some days it works better than others, and on the days when it works least well, I try to remember that I got us out, that whatever I understood or failed to understand about what was happening, I stood at the bottom of that staircase and I said what needed to be said, and I got my family out, and that matters even if I can't fully explain it. And even if I'm not sure it's over. What would you have done is a question I have asked myself so many times that it has almost lost meaning, and I ask it of you now in genuine curiosity rather than rhetoric, because I think the choices available to a person in that situation are more limited than they appear from the outside. And I think the thing that most people don't understand about being inside a frightening situation is that your capacity for rational decision-making is precisely what the situation impairs, and that the person you think you would be when faced with something terrifying is not necessarily the person you actually become when the terror is real and present and located in the house where your child sleeps. And I'm not making excuses for the things I did or failed to do. I'm trying to explain a state of mind that I think is more universal than people want to acknowledge. The state of mind in which knowing and doing come apart from each other in a way that makes you feel like you are watching yourself from a slight distance. Making choices you can see are inadequate, but are unable to improve upon, because the gap between understanding and action has somehow become too wide to bridge in real time. Looking back now, across the months of distance and therapy and the slow rebuilding of something that functions like ordinary life, I can see the shape of what happened in a way that I couldn't see it while I was inside it. And what I see is a pattern that has a beginning long before we moved into that house, and possibly a continuity that extends beyond our departure from it. And the pattern, as I understand it now, is this. Certain spaces develop the capacity to learn their inhabitants, to map them thoroughly enough that they can produce functional replicas, starting with the voice, because the voice is the most distinctive and identifying feature of a person. The thing by which we recognize each other and feel recognized, and then proceeding from the voice towards something more complete, something that might eventually be comprehensive enough to pass, not just in the dark or over the phone or in a recorded message, but in full presence, in daylight, in all the sensory complexity of direct human contact. And I think the house had been doing this for a long time, through a series of inhabitants, learning something from each one and adding it to what it already knew, building itself into something more capable with every family that moved through it. And I think we were not the last, but just the most recent, and I think whatever it learned from us, it is still using, still practicing, still perfecting, waiting for the next family to move in so that it can go further than it got with us. I want to tell you something that I haven't told anyone else, not even Vikram, not even the therapist who I see on Tuesday afternoons in a bright, comfortable office with a plant on the windowsill and a box of tissues on the coffee table that I have used more times than I want to count. And what I want to tell you is this. I received a call 3 weeks ago from the unknown number, the one that I thought had been silenced when we left the house, the one that I had thought was contained there, and I did not answer it. I stood and watched my phone ring with that number on the screen, and I did not answer it. And after 7 rings it stopped, and I have not heard from it since. But I know that 7 rings is not a conclusion. 7 rings is a message, and the message is that it knows where I am and it is being patient. And I don't know what to do with this knowledge except share it with you and ask you to believe me when I say that whatever this is, it is not finished with me. And I'm not sure I'm capable of being finished with it. And the worst part is that sometimes, very late at night when I cannot sleep and the flat is quiet and Arian is breathing peacefully in the next room, I find myself almost curious about what it wants, about what it has learned, about what version of me exists inside that house right now, practicing in the dark. And then I pull myself back from that curiosity, because I know it is not entirely my own. I know something is feeding it into me from a distance, the way it fed warmth into me when I first saw the house and called it my own feeling. And I hold on to the knowledge of that distinction,
even on the days when the distinction feels thin as paper, because that distinction is the last line I have, and I am not ready to give it up. Now that I think about it carefully, I'm not even sure that the house was made of red brick or if it was actually painted plaster, or if maybe I'm confusing some of the physical details with somewhere else entirely. Because my memories have become so distorted by time and by trauma and by the process of reconstruction that happens when you tell a story repeatedly, each telling subtly altering the memory that the next telling draws from. And maybe that's the scariest thing of all, because if I can't trust my own mind about what I physically saw and touched, then how can I be sure about any of the other things that happened? And maybe I made some of it up. Not intentionally, not as a lie, but in the way the mind makes things up to fill gaps and make coherent narratives out of fragmented experiences. And maybe it happened differently from how I remember it, and maybe it's still happening right now and I'm experiencing it in a way that my mind has chosen to interpret as a memory from the past rather than a present reality. And I know that thought ought to be the most frightening thing I've written in this entire account, but somehow it isn't. Somehow I've lived with that uncertainty long enough that it has become just another part of the landscape, just another thing I carry, just another weight in the bag that I have been carrying since I was 12 years old. And my sister came out of a locked room, wearing a face that was almost, but not quite, the one she'd gone in with.
Does this match your experience? I am asking genuinely, not rhetorically, not as a device, but as a real question to a real reader, because I have shared this account in various forms with various people over the past year, and the responses have sorted themselves into roughly 3 categories. The people who are immediately skeptical and say so, which I respect. The people who are immediately credulous and say so, which I also respect, but which makes me slightly cautious because sometimes credulous people are credulous because they want to believe, rather than because they recognize something true. And the third group, which is smaller than the other 2, but which I find most interesting and most comforting, which is the group of people who read or hear this account and go very quiet for a moment before saying something like, "That reminds me of a house I lived in," or "I had something happen to me that I've never been able to explain." And it is for this third group that I am most grateful, not because their confirmation validates my experience, but because knowing that I am in a group of more than one changes the texture of the experience, makes it something other than a solitary aberration, makes it part of a pattern that might have an explanation, even if that explanation is not currently available to me.
I want to tell you about what happened to Priya because I promised I would come back to it. And I think you deserve the full account after everything I've asked you to hold alongside me in this telling. And what happened to Priya after she came out of the locked room was this. For several months she was quieter than usual, and she would sometimes speak in ways that seemed not quite right for a 7-year-old, using constructions and references that didn't belong to her particular vocabulary, and she was afraid of certain things she had not previously been afraid of and inexplicably unafraid of other things that should have frightened a child of her age. And then gradually these things resolved or seemed to resolve, and by the time she was 9 she seemed entirely herself again, or what everyone agreed to treat as entirely herself. And she grew up and went to college and got married and has 3 children of her own now and lives in Bangalore and calls me on birthdays and festival days, and we talk about ordinary things, and neither of us mentions what happened in that room because we have both made the same decision about it, which is the decision to close the door and build the wall and call the wall truth. And I wonder sometimes what would happen if I called her up and told her about the Lucknow house and asked her directly what happened in that room in Allahabad, what she saw or heard or felt in those 3 days, what she remembers and what she has chosen not to remember. And I wonder if she has her own equivalent of my photograph, her own equivalent of the man on the road who knew her face, her own equivalent of the voice calling from a floor where the child was not. And I think she probably does. I think she has been carrying her own version of this for 30 years in the same silence I have been carrying mine. And maybe that conversation is one we will have someday, and maybe it is one we will take to our respective graves, and I honestly don't know which of those outcomes I want more. I still don't understand what the thing in the house was, in the sense of understanding its nature, its origin, its purpose, if it had a purpose, the mechanism by which it operated, and I've read things since that have offered frameworks, theories about residual consciousness that accumulates in certain spaces over time, theories about entities that feed on human presence and human fear.
Theories about places that exist at some kind of confluence of energies that makes them permeable to things that don't normally intersect with human experience. And none of these frameworks is entirely satisfying, and all of them have something useful to offer, and what I have settled on is not a theory exactly, but a relationship with not knowing, an acceptance of the fact that some things happen in the world that don't fit the current categories of understanding, and that the right response to this is not to insist they therefore didn't happen, but to hold them with the kind of careful attention you give to something you can't yet name, but that is clearly real and clearly present and clearly asking to be recognized. I think about the woman in the photograph, and I wonder about her life in that house.
Whether she knew what she was living with, whether she made choices that I would recognize as similar to my own, whether she got out, or whether she stayed until the house had learned her so completely that the distinction ceased to matter. And I wonder about the family that moved into the house before us, and whether they left something of themselves behind, and whether that something is still there in the rooms. A remnant of their particular frequency that the house has been practicing with. And I wonder whether some remnant of us is also there now, being practiced with, being refined, being made into something more convincing than it was when we were physically present to compare it to. Looking back now from this distance with what I know and what I will probably never know sorted into their respective piles. The thing that strikes me most is not the fear, though the fear was considerable, and not the confusion, though the confusion was comprehensive, but rather the intimacy of the experience. The horrible intimacy of being known that thoroughly by something you cannot see or name or touch, of having your voice and your face and your habits and your history learned by something operating in the dark of a house you thought was yours, of understanding that your most private self had been the object of careful and sustained attention for months before you became aware of it, and that this attention had found things in you that you had worked hard to keep from the world. The grief about Priya, and the guilt about our finances, and the specific quality of my love for Aryan that lives right next to the specific quality of my fear for him and is sometimes indistinguishable from it. And whatever the thing in the house was, it knew all of these things, and it used them, and that use felt like a violation, in a way that physical violation does not quite capture, because what was violated was not my body, but my interiority, myself, the private architecture of being the person I am, and the restoration of that privacy is what I am still working on, what I wake up every morning and try to rebuild with the inadequate tools of therapy and time, and the ordinary busy business of living a life that is, for now, blessedly unremarkable. If I'm being honest, and I have been trying to be honest throughout this entire account, even when the honesty was uncomfortable for me, and possibly for you. The thing I am most afraid of is not that the house is still there and still practicing and still waiting for a new family, though that does frighten me, and not that the phone will ring again from that number, though that frightens me too, but rather that whatever it was learning to do, whatever it was building toward with its careful, patient study of our voices and our faces and our ways of moving through a space, is not confined to that house, that it has extended itself somehow, that the number that has called me in Lucknow after I've left is evidence of a reach that is not limited by geography or by the physical boundaries of a particular building, and that wherever I go, I am carrying some tag that makes me findable, some marker it placed on me during those months of observation that I cannot remove because I don't know where it is or what it looks like, and that the distance I have put between myself and that house is distance it can cross without particular effort, because the distance that matters was never physical, and this is the thought that I have to work hardest to manage, the thought that sends me to the kitchen at 2 in the morning to make tea and count slowly and remind myself of what I know to be true and real and mine. Vikram and I don't talk about it often now. We have had the main conversation, and we have had several subsidiary conversations, and we have reached a kind of agreement without having formally articulated it, which is that we will protect Aryan from whatever follow-on effects this experience has on us to the best of our ability, and that we will watch him for signs of anything unusual without making him feel watched, which is a difficult balance to maintain, but one we are managing reasonably well, and that we will not move into another old house, which is an agreement that has required no effort whatsoever to keep, because neither of us has felt any pull toward old houses since that February night. Neither of us has looked at a property listing for anything built before this decade without an involuntary physical response that makes further consideration impossible. And I think our bodies have learned something that our minds are still in the process of learning, which is that certain preferences are worth revising in light of certain experiences, and that the longing I felt for old walls and old rooms and the
particular kind of history that has had time to accumulate into something with texture and weight is a longing I can mourn the loss of without returning to it, the way you can mourn the loss of a capacity for trust that has been damaged without needing to pretend the damage isn't there. I want to ask you something before I finish, and I want you to try to answer it honestly, even if the answer is uncomfortable. Do you check all the rooms when you come home? Not the safety check, not the locking up check, but the real one. The one you do when something somewhere in you needs to confirm that the house is yours, that the space contains only what you put into it, that the corners are empty and the rooms are quiet and nothing is listening in the upper floor. Because I do it every time I come home. Even in this blank modern flat with its no history and its tinted windows and its neighbors who have lived there a combined total of perhaps 4 years, I come home and I go through every room and I listen at doors before I open them and I check under things and I look at the ceiling and I stand at the bottom of the stairs and look up before I go up. And I do all of this not because I believe the thing from the house has followed me here, or not only because of that, but because I have learned something about the world that I cannot unlearn. Which is that the spaces we live in are not passive containers for our lives, but active environments with their own qualities and their own histories and their own obscure relationships to the things that move through them. And that paying attention to those qualities is not paranoia, but a kind of respect, a kind of awareness that perhaps we owe our spaces and that our spaces in turn owe us, and that the exchange of that awareness is what makes a house a home rather than something else entirely. Something that wears the appearance of home the way a mimic wears the appearance of its model, perfectly convincing from a distance and deeply, fundamentally wrong up close. I think I remember every moment of that night with a clarity that I don't trust entirely, and I remember the cold air when we got outside, and Arian's weight against my side, and Vikram's hand at my back, and Biscuit's low-held tail preceding us through the gate, and the house behind us looking like nothing at all, looking like a house. And I remember that as we drove away, I looked back in the side mirror and every window was still dark, and I think I remember that one of the upstairs windows showed something that might have been a shape and might have been a trick of the light, something standing at the glass and watching us go. And I can't tell you with certainty whether I actually saw that or whether I constructed it afterward from the raw material of fear and expectation. But I can tell you that what I felt in that moment was not the relief I had expected, but something more complicated, something that had grief in it. Because whatever was in that house was something that had been alone in it for a very long time and had been doing what it knew how to do, in the only way it knew how to do it. And I don't know how to hold that alongside everything else it did to us, alongside the fear and the disruption and the violation of our privacy. But I feel like the attempt to hold it is part of being a person who takes the full weight of experience seriously, even the parts that are inconvenient or that complicate a neater version of the story in which the thing in the house is simply a monster and we are simply its victims, and leaving is simply the end of the story, because I know now that none of those things is simply anything, and that the honest account requires holding all of the complexity, even when the complexity is exhausting, and even when a simpler version would be more comfortable to carry. It didn't make sense until I was sitting in Anand's guest room on that first morning away from the house, with Arian asleep on the bed beside me and the sound of the city outside the window. Ordinary city sounds, traffic and crows and someone's pressure cooker. The specific symphony of Indian urban morning that I had always found somehow comforting, and I realized that what had been happening in that house was not random, was not undirected, but was purposeful in a way I had not understood while I was inside it, that the thing there was working towards something specific, that its gradual study of us, its practice with our voices and our faces and our habits, was not an end in itself, but a preparation, and that what it was preparing for was the moment when its preparation would be complete enough that we would no longer be able to distinguish its version of us from the real versions. And I think the footsteps in the hallway and the voice calling from upstairs and the phone calls from the unreachable number were not random hauntings, but trials, test runs, quality checks, the thing in the house determining how close its reproductions had come to the originals and where further refinement was needed, and that Arian's nighttime visitor was the most advanced of these preparations, the thing's longest running and most intimate study, and that the voice I heard calling from upstairs on the night we left was not quite right yet, but was considerably closer than it had been 3 months before. and that if we had stayed another 3 months or 6, it might have reached the threshold it was working toward, and I still don't know what happens when a mimic reaches that threshold. I don't know what it does with a perfect copy when it has one, and I don't know if not knowing that is a mercy or another wound, and I think I will be asking that question for the rest of my life. Looking back now, I can say with some certainty that the experience changed me in ways that are both loss and gain, which I know sounds like the kind of thing therapists say, and which I am therefore slightly embarrassed to say, but which I believe to be genuinely true. And the loss is the one I've described. The privacy, the ease, the uncomplicated faith in spaces and in the evidence of my own senses, and in the stability of the world as I understood it. And the gain is harder to articulate, but has something to do with attention, with the kind of careful paying attention that I now bring to spaces and to people, and to the small signs that something is or is not what it presents itself to be. And I think that kind of attention has made me a better mother, a better wife, a better reader of situations, even though it comes from a source I would not have chosen and costs me more than I would like to pay. In terms of sleepless nights and the background frequency of anxiety, that is now simply part of how I experience the world. And I am trying to think of it not as damage but as information. Not as what the house took from me, but as what I took from the house, which is the knowledge that what you cannot see is not necessarily not there, and that what you can see is not necessarily what it appears to be, and that the space between those two facts is where most of the interesting and most of the terrifying things in the world are located. The last thing I want to tell you, and then I will let you go back to whatever ordinary Tuesday or Wednesday or Saturday you were having before you started reading this, is that Arian said something to me last month that I have been turning over in my mind ever since, and that I want to share with you because I don't know what to do with it, and because sharing it feels like the only thing available to me when I don't know what else to do. And what he said was this. We were sitting in the kitchen of the new flat, after dinner, doing the nothing much of an ordinary evening. He was drawing. I was having my last cup of tea. Vikram was in the other room with the television, and Arian looked up from his drawing and said, with the directness that children sometimes use for things adults have spent years learning to approach obliquely. "Mummy, do you think the friend from the old house is okay?" And I asked him what he meant, and he said that he had been thinking about the friend who lived there and wondering if the friend was lonely now that we had gone. And I sat very still with my tea cooling in my hands, and I thought about how to answer this question, about what it meant that he was framing it this way, about whether this was innocuous child psychology or something that required me to be worried, and what I said was, very carefully, "I think the friend will find other friends." And Arian nodded like this made sense to him and went back to his drawing. And the drawing he was making was of our family in the new flat, with Biscuit and the windows and the view from our balcony. A cheerful, chaotic 5-year-old's drawing of his home. And I looked at it for a long time, and I thought, for the first time in months, that we were going to be okay. That whatever had happened to us in that house had not succeeded in its final aim. That we were still ourselves, still recognizably us, still the same people who had moved in with hope and escaped with each other, and that the friend from the old house was not with us. Was back there in its cold rooms with its practiced voices and its studied faces and its endless, patient hunger, waiting, learning, preparing, and that whatever it did next, it would do without us. And for now, for today, that was enough. Author's note. I want to be honest with you about why I wrote this, because I think honesty about the origins of a story is a kind of respect for the reader who has given it their time. And what I can tell you is that this account comes from a place of genuine preoccupation, a years-long thinking about of questions that I don't have complete answers to, and that I suspect don't have complete answers. Questions about spaces and memory and the way the past inhabits the present, about what it means for a place to learn its inhabitants, about the particular intimacy of being known by something you cannot see or name. And these questions feel urgent to me in a way that requires creative expression to manage, which is, I think, why I write at all. Because some thoughts are too large to simply carry in the mind and require externalizing in order to be lived with. And this story is an externalization of thoughts that have been with me for a long time. Thoughts about the houses I have lived in, and the things I have felt in them, and the gap between what I can explain and what I have experienced. A gap that is, if I'm being honest, rather wider than I would prefer. The details that feel most real to me in this account are the ones about childhood and about the specific quality of maternal fear, the fear that is inseparable from love and that lives so close to it that sometimes you cannot distinguish which feeling you are feeling. And I think those details feel real because they are real, because I drew them from the actual texture of actual experience rather than from imagination. And I think that grounding is what makes the more extraordinary elements of the story feel possible, rather than simply incredible, because the extraordinary is most convincing when it has its roots in the genuinely ordinary, in the real weight of a child's body and the real smell of chai and the real particular silence of a house when you are alone in it at 2 in the morning. I did research for this story about certain folklore traditions regarding what various cultures call mimics, echo entities, hunger spirits, the many named things that are supposed to inhabit spaces and learn their human occupants over time, and I found these traditions spread across cultures with a consistency that I found either very interesting or very alarming, depending on my mood that day and what they share across all the cultural variations. Is this: the thing learns your voice first, then your face, then something less nameable that has to do with your interior life. And the learning is always gradual, and always patient, and always purposeful. And what it intends to do with what it has learned varies by tradition, but tends in the direction of replacement, which is the thing I find most persistently unsettling about these traditions, and which is the thing I have tried to put at the heart of this story. What scares me most about the story I have written is not the supernatural element actually, or not primarily, but rather the ordinary human elements that surround it, the way a person can know something and still not act on it, the way love for a place can blind you to what the place is doing to you, the way the need for certainty can cause you to paper over evidence that contradicts the narrative you have constructed for yourself, and the way trauma from the past can make you vulnerable in the present in ways you don't recognize until you are already vulnerable and already past the point of easy retreat. And these things are true whether or not there is anything supernatural operating in the situation. And that's what I keep coming back to when I think about why this particular story felt necessary to tell, because the horror of not trusting your own perceptions and not being believed by the people around you and not being able to protect your child from something you cannot name or locate is not a supernatural horror exclusively. It is also a very ordinary human horror, and maybe that's the most important thing I wanted to say. I want to hear from you, genuinely. I want to know if anything in this account resonated with something in your own experience, because the questions I am most interested in are not the ones about ghosts or entities or supernatural phenomena specifically, but the larger questions about attention and spaces and what we allow ourselves to know and what we choose not to know. And if you have ever lived in a place that felt wrong in a way you couldn't explain, or if you have ever noticed something off about a person that you convinced yourself was your own imagination, or if you have ever heard your own name in a voice that was almost but not quite the right voice, I would genuinely like to know, because I'm still collecting the data of other people's experiences against the data of my own and trying to understand what the overlap reveals. And I am not done thinking about any of this, and I suspect I won't be done for a very long time. The thing I want you to understand more than anything else in this account is that the experience of the protagonist is not presented as a lesson or a warning in the conventional narrative sense, is not intended to communicate. You should not buy haunted houses because that would be a rather thin moral for a rather lengthy account, but is instead an attempt to accurately render what it feels like to be inside an experience that exceeds your current categories of understanding, to be the person in the story rather than the reader of it, to inhabit the confusion and the denial and the eventual terrible clarity of a situation that you cannot resolve by being smarter or braver or more skeptical. A situation that requires you to simply be in it and come out the other side, changed by what you have been in. And I think that experience is more universal than the specific supernatural mechanics of this particular story. And I think that universality is what I was reaching for, even when I was ostensibly writing about voices and photographs and things that call from floors where no one is. Please share your experiences, if you have them, because I believe that the community of people who have lived with things they cannot explain is larger than we know, and that the silence we maintain about these experiences serves no one and possibly serves the things we maintain the silence about. And I would rather we talked in whatever form and in whatever terms feel available to us than continued the particular family habit of building walls around rooms and calling the walls truth, because I have seen where that habit leads, and it leads eventually to a kitchen and a dupatta and a small hand and a voice calling from somewhere your child is not, and whatever else I am uncertain of, I am certain that we can do better than that. I found the photograph again last night in a box I had not opened since we moved, and the woman in the back row has my face, and on the back, in handwriting I do not recognize, but that looks enough like mine to make my hand shake as I hold it. Someone has written a date from 40 years in the future, which is next year, and, below the date, in that same almost familiar hand, are 4 words that I have been sitting with since I found them, and that I am going to share with you now because I cannot share them with anyone else, and because the weight of them is more than I can carry alone, and the 4 words are simply these: she never really left.